I gave him life.
What makes the horror genre so enticing to us? Is it the feeling of dread that looms in the air, the search for what tingles your spine, or perhaps it's the charm and wit of boundary-pushing films filled with schlock and awe? Whatever it is that entices you to watch a movie that makes you afraid of things that go bump in the night, I invite you to take a seat and learn about the rich history of your favorite horror films, where they came from, and the influence it has on cinema history. I'll be taking you on a spiraling journey retracing the most impactful horror movies and trends over the decades, the birth of different subgenres, and the fight against censorship in an attempt to catalog the complete history of horror films. Horror movies are like spicy foods. At first, things like peppers and hot sauce make your mouth burn, but as you condition yourself eating jalapenos here, adding spicy seasonings there, your tongue's palate gets used to the pain and you're soon able to enjoy more complex flavors. Aliens, zombies, found footage, vampires, werewolves, exploitation, giallo, body horror. The list of subgenres in horror seemingly goes on forever, ranging from the cutest creatures to the spine-tingling supernatural. The history of horror is vast, and fortunately, we live in a time where watching these impactful movies and understanding these subgenres, where they came from, why they exist, and what happened to them is information more widely available than it's ever been. With such a large catalog of influential and impactful horror films and media, it can be difficult giving each one their due praise. Throughout this video, we'll talk about the growth of the genre from the beginnings of film to the modern age while showing examples of important films of their decade. However, that doesn't mean that they're the only influential films of their time. If this particular program leaves you excited and wanting for more, please do leave us a positive review and a healthy thumbs up as we move into the beginnings of film during the silent film. Our first stop on the train of terror begins in the early days of the film industry from the 1900s until the beginning of the 1930s. During this time, the film industry was smitten with the likes of Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton, which is what occupied American theaters in the 1920s. Horror films in the United States were very far and few in between. Although it's documented that in 1896, the first horror film ever created was called The House of the Devil by George Méliès, it only lasted a couple of minutes, and so I wouldn't really recognize it as the first proper horror feature film. It looks silly by today's standards, but this was the first time people were seeing what's called a jump cut. One of the first in-camera effects ever shown in cinema history, bringing the imagery of demons and ghosts to life. Méliès was later recognized as the grandfather of special effects as he moved into creating films like The Astronomer's Dream and A Trip to the Moon. Although a lot of movies during the silent film era had at times very unsettling images, the intention of a lot of these movies were more humorous and playful. Still, one can't ignore how some movies undoubtedly attempted to strike thoughts of horror and dread in their audience. One in which is 1911's Italian film L'Inferno, based on Inferno of Dante's Divine Comedy. The movie follows Dante being led by Virgil through the circles of hell and bringing to life these fantastically morbid visuals pulled from the epic poem. Watching Dante and Virgil witness the carnal sinners float above them, or watching the two walk through the circle of glutton with these naked bodies laying on the ground pelted by rain, feels so horrifying to watch. Watching the film in the dark with the lights turned off can feel very unsettling. Between the 1900s to the 1930s, the silent film era for horror consisted of literary works of past Gothic tales like The Phantom of the Opera and The Hunchback of Notre Dame. The most influential genre films of the era came from the Expressionist movement in Germany with movies like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu, two films that have iconically given inspiration to some of the most celebrated directors of our time, most notably the works of Tim Burton.
This This town needs an enema.
German Expressionism used tall, sharp, and warped buildings, shadows that were painted on walls to give rooms these unnatural shapes, misshapen windows and doors, exaggerated towns and buildings. Almost every Tim Burton film uses this art style to show these dreamscapes of the macabre by using these harsh shadows and exaggerated silhouettes as ways to signify feelings of dread and tension. And although Tim Burton is the most well known for his use of Expressionism, the influence of these landmarks can be seen in multiple movies throughout film history. Citizen Kane's use of harsh lighting and tilted cameras is very reminiscent of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Noir films also pulled a lot of inspiration from the lighting used in German Expressionism. Even films like Disney's Fantasia have scenes referencing the art style of these gothically set stories. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu is what some consider the beginning of the horror genre, since the term horror film wasn't created until 1931 after the release of Dracula. And although horror films were few and far in between, the film industry in the United States was rapidly growing towards the end of the 1920s, and as more theaters opened up to show more movies to cash in on the new media, Universal Pictures in Hollywood, California would break into the industry in 1931 with the greatest addition to film.
And you can't piss on hospitality. I won't allow it!
How do you do? Mr. Carl Laemmle feels it would be a little unkind to present this picture without just a word of friendly warning. We are about to unfold the story of Frankenstein, a man of science who sought to create a man after his own image, without reckoning upon God.
Welcome to the golden age of horror films, where we've got the Monster Master Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, the Wolfman, the Mummy, Creature from the Black Lagoon, the Invisible Man.
I got it! I know your damn words, all right?
Hollywood's horror films were centered around these iconic monsters of the 30s leading up to the 50s.
Listen to them. Children of the night. What music they make.
Which were honestly just melodramas taking place on these striking gothic set pieces, where you can see the clear influence of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, with these long castle stairwells and deformed shadows to show both wonder and dread. 1931 marked the first introduction to the Universal monster classic, with Dracula starring Bela Lugosi. And since the term horror film wasn't created yet, the vampire movie was instead marketed as a love story, calling it the story of the strangest passion the world has ever known. Something I've always found interesting with Dracula was how it was filmed 2 different times and had 3 versions available for theaters: the English version, the Spanish version, and the silent film version. Instead of dubbing the actors' voices, Universal Pictures would instead hire foreign actors to refilm the movie to release for the foreign market. During the day, Todd Browning would direct the English version of Dracula, and by night, George Melford would use the sets to create the Spanish version of Dracula. So there's actually 2 different versions of the movie.
Escúchalo. Son los hijos de la noche. Qué hermosa música componen.
However, the idea ended up being a flop, and so Dracula was the last film that Universal Pictures did this idea with. Even during the transition of sound, some theaters even had a silent film version with inner titles cut into the scenes. If you want even more versions of the movie, there's the original score, which is just the title sequence with Swan Lake played in the background. Or you could have the Philip Glass score that was created in 1999. The point is, this movie has more versions than your modern-day Zack Snyder film. Dracula was a resounding success, and Universal Studios wanted to capitalize on their recent venture, immediately going into production with their next motion picture, Frankenstein. Production of the film was incredibly quick. It began in August 1931, concluded in October of the same year, and released in November. Bela Lugosi, who had just found success with Dracula, was hoping to land the role of Henry Frankenstein, but was offered the role of the monster, which at the time of the pitch had no emotional pathos added to it. Lugosi famously turned down the role, and instead it was given to Boris Karloff in the classic story of a misunderstood man-made creation and its mad scientists. Frankenstein was a cinematic masterpiece with some of the most iconic images in film history. It's been referenced countless times throughout the history of cinema, and its artistic style of grasping German expressionism influenced some of our favorite movies to this day. Something I find interesting is that both Dracula and Frankenstein ended up being censored by the Motion Picture Production Code, commonly referred to as the Hays Code, that took place between 1934 to 1968. It provided films with do's and don'ts on what Hollywood films should be depicting, and studios followed the guideline all the way until I think like around the mid-1950s. These guidelines forced cuts in movies deemed to be too much for viewers, such as the ridicule of the clergy, the use of drugs, the use of firearms, pointing profanities at God, and white slavery. As tame as these films are to a modern day viewing, at the time these movies were very revolutionary and frightening to audiences worldwide. There's a famous line in Frankenstein where Henry says,
"Oh, in the name of God, now I know what it feels like to be God."
In the 30s, that was a pretty blasphemous thing to say, and so they replaced the second half of that line with thunder.
"Oh, in the name of God, now I know what it feels."
The restored line actually only became available in 1999 on VHS and DVD, and before that it was only available on Laserdisc to get the restored version. The reason why I find this interesting is because in the movie Scream, which came out in 1996, it played the censored version on VHS because that was the only version that was available in that format until 1999.
It's alive! In the name of God, now I know what it feels.
So, if you or your kids watch Frankenstein with its modern cut nowadays and end up loving it and then went to go watch Scream, you'd be confused as to why there's a thunderclap covering up an iconic line. Another interesting tidbit is that the Castle thunderclap recorded specifically for the censorship of Frankenstein is also incredibly famous and has been recycled, updated, revised, and used through films and TV ever since it was released. You can find it in Pee-wee's Big Adventure,
I don't need anybody!
The Haunted Mansion, Back to the Future, and Ghostbusters, making it kind of the Wilhelm scream of horror movies. The Wolfman stars Lon Chaney Jr., who would reprise his role in 4 sequels as the Wolfman. He's also the son of Lon Chaney, who was an actor and makeup artist for movies like The Phantom of the Opera and The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Although not the first werewolf film ever created, it's really what catapulted the werewolf subgenre into the mainstream, even though Universal Pictures released Werewolf in London in 1935, 6 years prior to The Wolfman. However, that movie wasn't as much of a commercial success. And no, not an American Werewolf in London, just Werewolf of London. But it was a large influence on An American Werewolf in London and its sequel, An American Werewolf in Paris. Released in 1941, the movie is beautifully shot with these mist-covered forests and is a staple of the modern werewolf subgenre. It's also an original screenplay written by the Jewish screenwriter Kurt Siodmak, who used the Wolfman as a way to represent his feelings of being forced to leave Germany when Hitler's Third Reich came to power. Movies like The Invisible Man, The Mummy, and Creature from the Black Lagoon would join the Universal Monster lineup, becoming iconic symbols of the golden age of horror, influencing modern directors with their groundbreaking special effects at the time.
And that's what happened to me, and I really had this vision of Julie Adams swimming over the Gilman in Creature from the Black Lagoon, and I thought that's the most beautiful image I've ever seen. And I really, at age 6, I really thought they're going to end well. They're going to end up together. It was the first time I saw it, and when it ended really, really bad, I thought I got to correct this.
During this time, other very important horror films were created outside of Universal's scope, one of which was directed by Todd Browning, the director behind Dracula and his next film, Freaks.
We accept one of us.
Gooba gobble, gooba gobble.
We accept her. Google gobble.
A trapeze artist named Cleopatra is part of a traveling carnival sideshow where she seduces a little person named Hans, even though he's engaged to Frida. After finding out that Hans has inherited a fortune, she plots to kill him along with Hercules, another member of the carnival. When the freaks announce that they have come to accept Cleopatra as a member of their untraditional family of freaks, she begins to mock and berate them along with Hans. The sideshow family doesn't take this lightly and begins to plot their demise. I love this movie and think it's way better than Dracula and one of Todd Browning's best films, which is a shame because this was pretty much, the last movie that he made. Freaks is very misinterpreted and as much of a horror film as something like Parasite or Aliens is. It's filled with these vignettes of the troops' everyday life, like just going out and enjoying themselves under the sun, or the super sweet way that Frozzo interacts with Schlitz.
Oh, hello, Elvira.
Hello, so.
Hello, Jenny Lee. Look, hasn't Slitzy got a beautiful dress? Isn't that pretty? When I get to Paris, I'm going to buy her a big hat with a long feather on it.
To even accept Cleopatra, a seemingly normal, able-bodied woman, into their family after she marries Hans, it just absolutely melts my heart. When the movie was released, it caused such a huge controversy that its original runtime of 90 minutes was cut down to a little over an hour, with the rest of its content lost to cinema history because of the unfavorable response they gained during test screenings. It was also banned in the UK by the British censors for over 30 years before finally being granted an X rating in 1963, saying exploited for commercial reasons the deformed people that it claimed to dignify. Ironically, Todd Browning was actually a circus performer himself at the age of 16 as a contortionist and clown, and insisted on casting the kind of persons with disabilities that he knew from his work experience and fascination with carnivals. Alone, that is remarkable considering if this movie was remade today, it'd probably hire non-disabled actors and instead use makeup and special effects to play their parts instead. Since its retrospective review, the film has become a cult classic and has even been submitted into the National Film Registry for preservation. And although Freaks was sadly swept under the rug, the 30s had another movie that was just too big to fit underneath one. Remade in 2005, the original King Kong from 1933 still stands the test of time for a modern-day viewing. The movie was incredibly advanced for its time on a technical level, using back projection, stop-motion animation predating Harryhausen, matte paintings, miniatures and models to create a beautiful piece of cinema with these lavish landscapes and intense scenes of amazing stop-motion animation. This was all done before green screens, digital effects, and digital editing software, and so seeing this movie be able to accomplish these fantastical scenes with what they had to work with is truly an eighth wonder of the world. The story is a classic, and its pacing is incredibly good for a movie with 2-3 act structures, when the crew arrives on the island and rescues their actress, and when they bring Kong back to the States. In a modern-day viewing, the movie's stereotypical depiction of people of color can be a bit jarring. Seeing people of color portrayed as just primitive tribes and the awkward parallel of slavery by bringing a gorilla with these big lips and flat nose chained up on a boat and brought to the United States can be a little bit hard to swallow. It's literally a parallel of the white man afraid of black men taking their white women away from them. For me, seeing an Asian person depicted as this cook with a fresh off the boat accent and attire just doesn't really sit well with me every time I see it.
Look, sir, me find on deck.
Native bracelet.
Crazy black man been here.
It's also pretty misogynistic at times towards women, like when the actress gets on the boat and is told that women shouldn't be on a boat, that a woman only brings trouble for men. It's kind of bad.
I think this is awfully exciting. I've never been on a ship before.
Well, I've never been on one with a woman before.
I guess you don't think much of women on ships, do you?
No, they're a nuisance.
Well, I'll try not to be.
You've been on the way already.
That being said, on a technical level, the movie is still fantastic and its story is as classic gets. The movie has been referenced, parodied, and analyzed throughout history as a highly influential film over its existence. But really, what's a giant monster film with only one monster? Why not 2? Why not 5? Why not more than just gorillas? What about insects, blobs, and radioactive?
Watch the skies.
Greetings, my friend. We are all interested in the future, for that is where you and I are going to spend the rest of our lives.
Coming off of World War II and into the age of rock and roll and drive-in movie theaters, science fiction became incredibly popular. War of the Worlds, The Day the Earth Stood Still, and Forbidden Planet were just some of the movies released during this time when, after the horrific events of the atomic bomb, people wondered if technology had gone too far.
それが度重なる水爆実験によって彼らの生活環境を完全に破壊された。もっと砕いて言えば、あの水爆の被害を受けたために安住の地を追い出されたと。
It is a ghost city. The buildings are in ruins. Its economy and its people are in ruins.
Capitalizing on the fear of the backlash from nuclear warfare, Japan created the kaiju subgenre with Gojira in 1954, the first film of the iconic monster Godzilla. Although with recent kaiju films such as Pacific Rim and Godzilla vs. Kong, the subgenre has shifted more towards action and adventure. However, the roots of the subgenre were born from the black and white Japanese film. The success of Gojira launched Toho into a kaiju frenzy by spitting out countless campy Godzilla films that became increasingly more ridiculous as the franchise continued. Mothra, Rodan, Gigan, and Ghidorah would become some of the most well-known kaiju monsters to ever bless the Godzilla franchise. These films are very hit and miss with audiences because they can be so ridiculous. For me, I still can't get the theme of Jet Jaguar out of my head, and it's been like over 15 years since I first saw Godzilla vs. Megalon.
Jet Jaguar, Jet Jaguar, Yata Jaguar.
Science fiction became the preferred source of media in the US. The entire decade was filled with movies about the radioactive, the strange, and the otherworldly. Almost every horror film at the time had a plot of science fiction, from movies like The Blob, a film about a literal mutagenic blob attacking people, and Them, a movie about gigantic ants. A lot of films in the 50s were very pro-military, and a majority of horror science fiction relied on the characters going to the government to seek protection from the monsters portrayed in the movies. This kind of propaganda ran rampant throughout the 50s, glorifying the military and the American US soldier. Movies like Them and Invasion of the Body Snatchers heavily relied on the government and military officials to fix the problems that the characters were faced with, whether it's giant monsters, aliens from another planet, or creatures created from the fallout of the atomic bomb. Although it seems hokey and cheesy by today's standards, Them was one of the first giant insect creature features that helped shape the landscape of science fiction films during its time. It still holds up to a modern-day watch with the amazing special effects used to create the giant ants portrayed throughout the movie. Invasion of the Body Snatchers would also become a science fiction staple, joining the National Film Registry to be preserved as a cultural or historically significant film. Even if you've never watched the movie or read the book it was based off of, Invasion of the Body Snatchers has been referenced and rehashed in different forms throughout the history of film that a modern audience would still probably know what the movie is about. It was largely ignored during its first theatrical run and has since been reassessed as a true classic of the science fiction genre, leading to it being remade in 1978, which is more than likely the version you're probably most familiar with. The movie attacks McCarthyism in an era of anti-communism, as well as the fear of losing individual identity, which would turn into a common theme throughout science fiction films. Although the 1982 version of The Thing by John Carpenter is commonly referred to as the remake of the 1951 film The Thing from Another World, the movies share very little similarities, to the point of the two movies being completely different in terms of plot, with the only shared qualities being the title and the setting. Both films were actually loosely based on the novella Who Goes There by John W. Campbell, and both movies use different parts of the novella to tell their story. The Thing from Another World uses the beginning of the novella, where a crew of researchers discover an alien spaceship buried in ice, and use thermite to excavate it, but accidentally end up destroying the spaceship, with its very iconic scene of the scientists tracing the object's shape with their bodies to discover it's a flying saucer. The scientists bring back an alien body that they discovered encased in ice near the wreckage and bring it back to thaw it out, releasing the monster inside. This is where The Thing from Another World diverges from the novella. Instead of having a shape-shifting monster that can take the form of any living creature, the monster in The Thing from Another World is instead an advanced plant-based organism that came from outer space and feeds on blood. Where John Carpenter's version of The Thing shows the monster in various forms, 1951's The Thing from Another World is a lot more reserved with its monster showcase, showing very small glimpses of the monster until around 50 minutes into the movie when we unexpectedly see the full creature even though it's only for a brief moment. The last 30 minutes of the film is a visual spectacle when we watch the monster attack the crew members and be doused with kerosene and then lit on fire repeatedly before it inevitably escapes. This was actually the first full-body person on fire stunt in cinema history, shot in this beautiful low-key black and white where the full-body stunt becomes the main source of lighting for the scene. The Thing from Another World received high praise on its release and has since been cited as one of the greatest science fiction films of the 1950s. The movie would also become highly influential to future directors such as Ridley Scott, Tobe Hooper, and most famously John Carpenter. He first references the film in Halloween, where Laurie Strode is seen watching The Thing from Another World on the night that Michael Myers returns to Haddonfield, and then went to create his own version of the film, releasing in 1982, paying homage to the original with its similar offbeat humor.
What did you say the number of that bulletin was? 629-49, item 6700, extract 75,131. Oh, that one.
Blair, have you seen Fuchs?
I don't want to stay out here anymore. I want to come back inside.
Having the same title sequence, and even having its own full-body fire stunt as a nod to its 1951 predecessor. Where science fiction became a huge influence on films during the 1950s, French films were becoming more unique and stylized, leading to the French New Wave movement going into the 1960s. Based on the book She Was No More, Le Diabolique is a French psychological horror film about a man named Michel, his wife Christina, and his mistress Nicole. Michel is an abusive husband and principal that runs a second-rate boarding school paid for by his wife, Christina. Michel also openly has a relationship with his mistress, Nicole, with whom Christina begins to grow a bond with while also openly knowing about the affair. Having enough of Michel's abusive tendencies, Christina and Nicole plot the murder of Michel and lure him out into town where they drown him in a bathtub. Returning back to their boarding school, the women dump the body into the school's neglected pool to frame the murder as a suicide, but when the pool is drained, they find out that the body is no longer there. Directed by Henri-Georges Clouzot, I got that one. The movie is alarming to have been made during the 50s and was received well by both critics and audience members. The film grew so popular with audiences that it became one of the first foreign films to be shown with a wider release in the US in multiple theaters, art houses, and drive-in movie theaters. The 50s marked the beginnings of the French New Wave movement in the 60s, where directors would become more of an auteur profession instead of just creating commercial cookie-cutter films. Le Diabolique is an example of a director who implemented their unique style into the movie. Not only do we see two very strong and independent female characters, which were very hard to come by during the 50s, but the way that the story unfolds and Clouzot's use of film composition, staging, and lighting techniques stylized the film unlike most horror movies of its time. At the climax of the film, the husband Michel rises from the bathtub and literally scares the main protagonist to death, revealing that Michel and Nicole had planned the entire ordeal together in order to inherit Christina's fortune. This makes watching the film multiple times more interesting, as we can see subtle visual clues that Clouzot uses throughout the film to foreshadow their diabolical plan. This is what's called the rule of triangle that you can see in multiple films that stage 3 or more characters inside of a scene. As an introductory scene of the characters' relationship early on in the film, on our first viewing as an audience member, we're sympathetic towards Christina and Nicole. However, visually, Clouzot cleverly stages the scene using the rule of triangle, placing both Nicole and Michel on the same plane while separating Christina to show her separation of the two characters. We can see this visual separation happen again during the dinner scene after Michel verbally abuses Christina to the point of her having to swallow spoiled fish. To visually represent her entrapment and imprisonment, the sets of the movie and lighting are dense with bars and railings to represent how oppressed Christina is throughout the film. Alfred Hitchcock was a huge influence on the French New Wave movement, and Clouzot pays homage to Hitchcock's Rear Window during the final scene where she investigates a mysterious light at the school. The use of strong, low-key lighting heightens the tension in the movie, and its lack of a musical score further exemplifies the terror. Hitchcock was also reportedly interested in directing an adaptation of the book She Who Was No More, but its rights were already given to Clouzot to create Les Diaboliques, and so Hitchcock instead gained the rights of The Living and the Dead from the same creators and turned that into Vertigo instead. The influence of Les Diaboliques on Hitchcock's Psycho is almost hard to deny. Both of them even including a murder located within a bathroom, a location where we as audience members see as a place of safety, which is then turned into a murderous scene.
Although it's a completely different style, you could see Hitchcock watching this and using it as inspiration. There's the grabbing, just like Janet Leigh grabbing of the shower curtain. There she is against the wall, and now does the slides down the wall. That to me is the same shot. That's the one thing that he said, yeah, I've got to steal it. It's too good. Victimized woman sliding helplessly down the wall. Of course, he does that same shot in The Birds. We saw it in The Man Who Knew Too Much. If Hitchcock didn't get to do the murder in the bathtub of Diabolique, his revenge was going to be the shower scene in Psycho. He said, I'll show that Clouzot.
Clouzot's marketing campaign for the film also included a no-spoiler warning for audience members. This was later replicated by Hitchcock to the same vein with the release of Psycho in 1960, 5 years after the release of Les Diaboliques. This can be looked at as two directors who highly respected one another's work during their time. During the mid-1950s, a production studio called Hammer Films became synonymous with the horror genre after the release of their film The Quatermass Experiment in 1955. Where the 1931 Universal monsters were black and white classics, Hammer took the properties and made iconic colorized versions of the films with significantly more on-screen violence and bloodshed. This was due to the advent of Technicolor, and in Dracula, which has now been renamed as The Horror of Dracula, is one of the first British horror films made using the 3-strip Technicolor process. Although color was already prominent throughout films during this time with movies like Singin' in the Rain, The Wizard of Oz, and Gone with the Wind, the technology of Technicolor was still very difficult to use on set, and horror films had a much lower budget than other, bigger Hollywood films that could comfortably use 3-strip cameras on their movie sets. It wouldn't be until the late 1950s that color became more standardized in movies with the advent of competition to Technicolor. Hammer films were what made actors like Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing become so iconic in the horror community, and is what revitalized the production company into becoming such a powerhouse inside of the horror genre. To avoid censorship from the BBFC, the Hammer Films company would regularly submit their films for review in their black and white prints in order to stifle the BBFC's recognition with their, at the time, extreme uses of blood. Some of the most recognizable films from Hammer were theatrical Gothic tales, so if you enjoy that type of cinema, they're definitely worth the watch. But besides a select few films that were great adaptations, such as The Curse of Frankenstein, The Curse of the Mummy's Tomb, or the demanding performance of Christopher Lee as Dracula, the quality and variety of Hammer films can vary wildly, especially during its later years. Movies like The Devil Rides Out are still coveted as being some of the best that Hammer has to offer going into the 60s, where the horror genre became increasingly more loved.
What does katana mean?
It means Japanese sword.
The 1960s was a very strange time for horror films. A majority of audiences were still burned out from the Universal monster classics and the low-budget sci-fi horror-adjacent movies of the 50s. Horror movies were put on the back burner of studio minds as just cheap thrills. However, directors still found ways to take the idea of horror movies and elevate them into a new light, such as the works of Alfred Hitchcock, Roman Polanski, and even in Japan as directors began melding its culture's folklore and mythologies into feature-length films. To me, I look at the 1960s as the decade where horror movies began to create powerful female leads and characters instead of being made through the eyes of a male protagonist, reflecting Western culture as this revival of feminism began to grow. Instead of placing stereotypical females into these horror movies, their characters became more fleshed out and involved in the actual plot of the films and not just being, damsels in distress. This movement becomes a standard portrayal as we move into the modern era of horror films with concepts such as the final girl trope, monstrous menstruation, and just general female empowerment. I would even go as far to say that the horror genre is one of, if not the most, female empowering genre in movies.
I gotta go. I am a god. Okay.
Eyes Without a Face is a perfect example of a female-centered horror film about a woman struggling to break out of her father's patriarchy. It's a black and white French movie revolving around a woman whose face becomes scarred and misshapen due to a car accident, leaving only her eyes intact. Her father and his assistant continuously insist that she wear a featureless mask to hide her disfigurement as they kidnap young women and graft their faces onto the daughter. Although poorly received on its initial release, it gained higher critical praise during its theatrical re-release in 1986, over 25 years since its original run, with its influence reaching to as recent as the 2011 film The Skin I Live In as its spiritual successor. In the documentary A Cut Above the Rest, a retrospective look at the making of the 1978 classic Halloween, John Carpenter even stated,
"It was originally written the way you see it. In other words, it's a pale mask with human features, almost featureless. I don't know why I wrote that down, why Deborah and I decided on that. Maybe it was because of an old movie called Eyes Without a Face. It's a French film, Franjou made it, and this girl had a burned face, so she wore this face mask. It was real creepy because it was featureless and immobile except for her eyes."
Eyes Without a Face came out during this French New Wave movement where art house films became more prominent, and so when Eyes Without a Face was released in France, it was probably shocking. I mean, in the 1960s, watching this scene where they're pulling the face off of their first victim is pretty gnarly for its time. If the shower scene in Psycho was already graphic enough for audience members, Eyes Without a Face would have been similar to torture porn on its release. For a modern day watch, the movie still holds up pretty well, and you can see the influence of German expressionism throughout the movie. It's so eerie watching this woman walking around with this featureless mask, longing for the outside world to the point of calling her fiancé that thinks that she's dead and just listening to his voice over the phone. A scene that is later replicated in Halloween when Michael picks up the phone with Laurie on the other end of the line.
This motel also has, as an adjunct, an old house, which is, if I may say so, a little more sinister looking, less innocent than the motel itself. And in this house, the most dire, horrible events took place.
1960 also saw the release of Alfred Hitchcock's most famous film, Psycho, a motion picture that forever changed the landscape of horror movies. At the time of its initial release, there was no other movie that was as controversial, shocking, and violent, leading to mixed reviews only to be reassessed years later, much like Eyes Without a Face. From an opening scene with an unmarried woman laying in bed with a man to the cross-dressing likes of Norman Bates, the film relentlessly attacks the audience with imagery far ahead of its culture's time. The movie opens up with its famous red herring, Marion Crane laying in bed with her boyfriend Sam Loomis. She comes across a cash payment of $40,000 from her work to deposit and decides to steal it and run away with Sam to start a life together. She stops for the night at the Bates Motel where she meets Norman Bates along with her infamous demise in the shower. The shower scene in Psycho is famously displayed in 52 cuts, rapidly spliced together. And in a scene that only lasted about 2 minutes, it disturbed audiences across the world.
The murder of a woman in a shower, of a nude woman. Now, as you know, you could not take the camera and just show a nude woman being stabbed to death. It had to be done impressionistically. So it was done with little pieces of film. The head, the feet, the hand, the shower itself. I think in that scene there were 78 pieces of film in about 45 seconds.
Not only did the movie kill off what was believed as the main character halfway through the film, it was incredibly violent and shocking for its time. This scene is so significant you can draw a visible line in the history of horror movies as films before and films after the shower scene of Psycho. Violence became a common aspect in films, and no longer were horrors derived from monsters and creatures like Dracula and Godzilla. Instead, the horrors were focused on the dark depths of the seemingly normal people around you. Saying Psycho is an important piece of horror film history would be an understatement, as it's synonymous with the genre at this point. Not only is the movie regarded as the first slasher film along with Peeping Tom, it was also highly influential for Italian horror films with how stylish and graphically intense it is, even for a black and white movie.
Oh, I just love my new gloves. Thanks.
Psycho has been referenced countless times. It's one of the most recognizable movies in film history, and its score is one of the most iconic to date. Again, we also have these believable, relatable, and independent female characters that make up the cast of the movie, and not just love interests for the male characters. And then we have Rosemary's Baby, a psychological horror movie about female domestication, the troubles of motherhood, and the horrors of involuntary birth. Directed by Roman Polanski, the film centers around the couple Rosemary and Guy as they move into a new apartment. When the couple starts making friends with the people in the building, Rosemary begins to uncover the secret occult that the residents of the apartment have joined. And in order to advance his acting career, Guy promises the life of his firstborn child, and that night, Satan visits Rosemary, raping and impregnating her with its child without her knowledge. The people in the building start to become heavily invested in the child, leading to Rosemary to believe that there's some kind of hidden agenda. Something I always find funny about this movie, not that the topic is funny, is how terrible Guy is at gaslighting. The night after Satan rapes Rosemary, he just plays it off that he's the one that had sex with her, and she says,
I didn't want to miss baby night.
You...
And a couple of my nails were ragged, and it was kind of fun in a necrophile sort of way.
It's like, wow. And here I thought that a complete stranger had raped me, but it was just my own husband that raped me. That makes me feel a whole lot better. When it comes to psychological films, Rosemary's Baby sits at the top as one of the best. It's got an amazing soundtrack, and although it's not the first psychological horror film, it's widely considered as the most quintessential along with Polanski's earlier film, Repulsion. Other films would follow in its steps for psychological movies like The Shining, and has become a recent subgenre trend in horror films like The Babadook and Midsommar. Hereditary actually follows the same themes as Rosemary's Baby, like involuntary motherhood and using the occult to highlight societal fears. I mean, both movies' occult followers actively falsify information towards the main protagonist in order to force them to do what they want. Rosemary's Baby highlights the distrust of people moving from rural homes to the city during the 60s, and Hereditary highlights the emotional distancing of the modern family. The occult uses both divisions to then push their agenda. That's not to say that the movies are the same, they're drastically different, but the foundation of the psychological subgenre from Rosemary's Baby can be seen in today's recent trend of horror films. During the 60s, writer and director Kaneto Shindo would create two amazing horror films in Japan entitled Onibaba and Kuroneko. Although different movies, Shindo's styles and themes of women and sexuality, grief and poverty can be seen in both films, which were shot in beautiful black and white negative. Personally, I love these movies because they're these samurai supernatural ghost films with incredibly surreal imagery. Onibaba is a tragic tale of a mother and daughter-in-law living in grief alone in a field of reeds, waiting for Kichi, the son of the mother and the husband of the daughter-in-law, to return from war. In order to survive, the two women ambush samurai soldiers and strip them of their armor and weapons, dumping their bodies into a deep pit and selling their goods to a merchant for food. One day, their neighbor Hachi, who was drafted into the war along with Kichi, returns home and informs them that Kichi had been killed. Kichi's wife begins to sleep with Hachi in order to deal with the grief of losing her husband, even though Kichi's mother disapproves of the intimate relationship, going as far as attempting to try and scare her into leaving Hachi using a Hanya mask she got from killing a samurai. It's a very slow burn, and the images on screen aren't going to be nightmare-inducing visuals, but the story and especially the atmosphere is unbridled in current films. There's just something about Japanese cinema from the 50s and 60s that really resonates with me, and Asian cinema is becoming more popular as Western media begins to adopt movies like Parasite and Train to Busan or shows like Squid Game. You have this beautifully shot movie that uses black and white film to tell this tragic story with these stark shadows and chilling soundscapes. The social criticism of the Civil War's effect on farmers during this transitional period of an agricultural society moving into an industrial one. Strong female characters that aren't ashamed of things like sex and violence, even though they're unnamed characters in the movie. Shindo's follow-up with Kuroneko is what I would consider the best horror film of the 1960s and one of my favorites of all time. A woman named Yon and her daughter-in-law Shige live in a house in a bamboo grove and are raped and murdered by a returning troop of samurai, burning down their home afterwards. The women return as ghosts, luring samurai into this illusion-based home in the grove to seduce and drink their blood. Meanwhile, Gintoki returns from the war and finds his mother and wife's home burned to the ground. He's made into a samurai in his return and is given the job to destroy the evil ghost killing the samurai, eventually coming to the conclusion that they are his own mother and wife. Again, the atmosphere and eeriness of the movie is further amplified by its beautiful black and white cinematography. It's such a tragic love story, and watching the characters travel through this eerie bamboo grove gives off such a feeling of dread mixed with these disturbing soundscapes. Both movies deal with these concepts of grief and lust that you just don't see in Western films during its time. To be frank, there's really nothing else like Onibaba and Kuroneko, and anyone who's interested in Japanese cinema should watch both of them at least once because they are amazing precursors to modern Japanese horror films like Ringyu and Ju-on. However, one movie steps up to the base with its own social commentary on the state of Western culture.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
Stop it! You're ignorant.
They're coming for you, Barbara.
Stop it! You're acting like a child.
They're coming for you. Look, there comes one of them now.
Although the reanimated dead in the film are never referred to as zombies, the 1968 independent classic Night of the Living Dead marks the beginning of the modern-day zombie subgenre. Previously, zombies were referred to as mindless slaves usually created by voodoo rituals like I Walked with the Zombie. But this idea of flesh-eating cannibalism from reanimated corpses was new territory, and the film shocked audiences with its visceral images and black lead actor. Night of the Living Dead is a significant horror movie on multiple levels. It created a subgenre of horror films with Romero's iteration of zombies that became adopted throughout its following years of release. At its time, the movie was incredibly shocking for its audience with its depiction of cannibalism and disturbing images. Not only do we have a child murdering her own mother, the audience's expectation of a white female lead is subverted almost immediately when Ben is introduced into the film, making it the first horror movie with a black lead actor. When Night of the Living Dead released, African Americans and people of color were stereotyped as tribal members, slaves and servants, or general backdrops for white actors to take center stage. Tropes like the sacrificial Negro were very common in film history as these characters that willingly sacrificed themselves to save the white protagonist. The 1960s were also an incredibly turbulent time for African Americans, with riots popping up in Harlem, LA, New Jersey, Detroit, and so on. The film was released in 1968, which is the same year that Martin Luther King was assassinated, and so the movie encompassed a lot of the tension that African Americans were feeling at the time.
I was probably way too young to see it, but I was absolutely fascinated by the fact that there was this beautiful, handsome black man. That was the first time I probably saw somebody black in a movie, and they weren't a criminal, and they weren't a gangster, and they were the hero.
From here, movies like Blackula became icons in the black community, where you have these intelligent, in-depth characters that aren't just furniture. And then you have the ending scene of the Night of the Living Dead, where this white-led mob comes to take care of the zombies and shoots Ben right in the middle of the head.
All right, Vince, hit him in the head, right between the eyes. Good shot. Okay, he's dead. Let's go get him. That's another one for the fire.
Which is such a strong message about systematic racism in the United States. As much as I love this topic, I'm afraid that I just won't do it justice because there's just so much to talk about. However, if you're interested in the black history of horror films, I recommend watching Horror Noir, where they discuss it in great detail with these iconic black actors and actresses. Night of the Living Dead encompassed the racial turmoil of the 1960s, and as the decade passed with more gruesome stories and terrifying films with relatable characters, we moved into the 1970s, where some of the greatest classics and pioneers of the genre were created.
The last house on the left. To avoid fainting, keep repeating. It's only a movie. Only a movie. Only a movie. Take as much as you can. Only a movie.
The 1970s of horror is one of the golden ages of the genre out of the sheer amount of influential movies that came out during the decade. This was also a time when horror movies started to become increasingly more violent and graphic, leading to an influx in exploitation films. These movies became more visceral because of the advent of television, and so having movies with more schlock that you couldn't see at home helped fill in the seats. Word of movies like The Last House on the Left spread like wildfire through news stations and film critics with how extreme the movie was. As a modern day viewer, I don't think you have to watch something like The Last House on the Left in order to appreciate the genre. In fact, watching the trailer alone and thinking of what the movie The Last House on the Left might be about and what scenes could be in it is probably a better way to remember the film than the actual movie itself. That's not to say that the movie wasn't influential, it definitely helped shape this idea of just how dark, twisted, and unnerving could a movie get. It also helped usher into this new exploitation category of films called the rape revenge subgenre, along with I Spit on Your Grave. Not only did these movies spark this specific genre of films, it also began the creation of another subgenre called backwoods, along with one of the most influential horror films of all time.
Texas Chainsaw Massacre was like one of those 16mm accident films they'd show you in school. You know, the grain of it and the saturated color of it, just really, I'd be having nightmares. I mean, that was really like being alive and watching something instead of something dead like a Hollywood film.
The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, released in 1974 by Tobe Hooper, is a landmark movie in the horror genre. An independent film that gained so much word of mouth due to how much it disturbed people that it gained a wide theatrical release and was subsequently banned by the British Board of Film Censors, restricting the movie from being shown in theaters or on television in the UK. If you're looking for a movie that captures the essence of independent, low-budget horror, it's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Everything about the movie feels so raw and uncomfortable, with shots that feel so visceral because its visually grainy aesthetic makes you feel as if you shouldn't be watching it. I don't think that I'll ever forget the scene where Leatherface first shows up and whacks the guy in the head with a meat grinder and the body just falls to the ground twitching. And then to see him grab the body and shut the door with no explanation is just amazing to me. With how much the movie cost to make and how much buzz it received, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre became a financial success in the next couple of years, even with its restrictions. The movie sparked motivation in independent filmmakers to create these strange and exploitive movies that push boundaries so their movies can spread through word of mouth. However, watching the movie nowadays, you'd be confused about how this shocked so many people when it's so incredibly tame. For a movie with chainsaw in its name, there's barely any blood and gore in it. Tobe Hooper actually intentionally made the movie tame with little to no gore, no nudity, and mild cursing, hoping to get a G rating, but ended up getting an X and having to resubmit a cut version for it to have an R rating. It also makes me sad that this movie was banned from the British Board of Film Censors when movies came out a year before that showed more undeniably graphic visuals than the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, with movies like The Exorcist, Jaws, and Alien. It really goes to show how much atmosphere can really lend itself into making somebody feel uncomfortable, even when you're not seeing someone being dismembered by a chainsaw on the screen. In fact, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre wasn't legally available to Britain in a DVD or VHS format until 1999. That's more than 25 years since its theatrical release. This heavy-handed censorship of these independent horror films became egregious as the decade went on, leading to the video Nasties list of the 1980s. These bans were targeted towards theatrical and VHS releases, and although this next film was never cut or banned in the UK, there were several attempts to stop its release from film to video.
The fact that people do wait 4 hours in line and then go back in to see more after they've fainted or gotten sick, I guess it shows how far some people will go for the thrill of being chilled to the bone. And judging from my long night in the lobby, the people most susceptible to being profoundly upset by the film are those who went in believing in the devil.
The Exorcist was released 1 year before the Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 1973 and became the first horror film to be nominated for Best Picture, which is a massive milestone for the genre. When it comes to accolades and awards, it's been documented how much the genre has been shunned with the Academy, generally looking down at the genre as subpar. Stephen King once quoted his own son on Twitter saying, "It's true, horror is usually considered a ghetto genre."
The thing about horror, and I think it's an interesting thing about the genre, is that the best horror films, to me, are the best films ever made. And they're made by the best people.
Right.
Like The Shining,
Well.
Rosemary's Baby, Hour of the Wolf, The Devils, Salo. These are films made by very important filmmakers, and they're great movies.
The Exorcist is no slouch and deserves its nomination with its spine-tingling visuals following this tragic tale of Father Karras trying to come to grips with his relationship with his own religion. Regan's monstrous menstruation as she moves into womanhood, and this amazing score using both Mike Oldfield for Tubular Bells and Krzysztof Penderecki. The Exorcist's use of Penderecki's orchestrated music was actually highly influential, and you can hear his music in The Shining and some of David Lynch's works. For modern-day horror, you can even hear how Penderecki's polymorphia influenced the musical scores of recent horror films. Out of the 95 Academy Awards, only 6 horror movies have been nominated for Best Picture in all of cinema history. Horror films are more or less seen as cheap thrills with no substance, and The Exorcist was able to break that mold with its chilling atmosphere and the unsettling thought of what could happen if your child was possessed by the devil.
Damien!
Amen.
I think my favorite scene from The Exorcist is when the drawer opens.
Did you do that? Do it again. In time. No, now. In time.
There's just something in the way that Regan repeats "in time" that just gives me chills. The movie is so beautiful to watch and breaks ground as a pioneer of the possession subgenre, followed up by The Omen, the Amityville Horror, and more recently movies like The Exorcism of Emily Rose. It's also a film that implies its themes of monstrous menstruation along with Carrie that was released in 1976. Movies centered around the idea that a woman's first period is like her coming of age and that this menstruation is a dramatic change in their body and attitude. Reagan literally transforms into this demonic entity on her 12th birthday. Carrie does the same thing, but it's more apparent with its opening scene when she gets her first period and the women in the locker room begin throwing tampons at her and chanting, It also marks the time that she begins to develop her kinetic powers.
We're all sorry about this incident, Cassie.
It's Carrie!
Ginger Snaps is another monstrous menstruation film released in 2000 where this high school girl gets bitten by a werewolf and we watch her literally transform into this monster while drawing a parallel to receiving her first period.
Oh shit.
Ridley Scott's Alien released in 1979 as a commercial success, but had mixed reviews from critics even though it's now considered to be one of, if not the greatest science fiction film ever created. Its isolation of space, phallic and vaginal images of fear from these creatures forcibly impregnating its victims caused a large sense of dread throughout the film.
What the hell is that?
Although usually eclipsed by its action-packed sequel Aliens, Alien is a horror film classic that continues to exceed expectations even with a modern-day viewing. The movie features a lot of visceral images made to induce panic. Ridley Scott made a conscious decision to have the film feature multiple phallic and vaginal imagery in order to make audience members feel uncomfortable. The entire idea of these aliens planting their parasites inside of people is a deliberate play on the male fears of female reproduction. The facehugger orally rape Kane and impregnate him through sexual domination, and is later penetrated again, but this time with a phallic-looking alien coming out of his chest. You'll also notice that the final form of the alien also contains both phallic and vaginal imagery, which is supposed to cause fear and anxiety with people as a response to sexual openness. Alien is a cultural icon and has been referenced in various forms of media for its beloved franchise and won an Academy Award in special effects. While theaters in the US were hogged up by The Exorcist, Alien, and Jaws, which would become the first Hollywood blockbuster, Italian horror cinema began to flourish with its provocative visuals and blood-drenched victims. Violent and graphic, but also visually striking. I'll never forget the opening credits of Blood and Black Lace with its bright red mannequins and green plants, or the scene in The Bird with the Crystal Plumage where the protagonist sees this stabbed woman crawling on the floor while he's trapped in this bright white prison. A popular trend during this time were what's called giallo films, which is like the equivalent meaning of something like a spaghetti western. You might have heard of recent films paying homage to this subgenre like Last Night in Soho and Malignant. Giallo films were thrillers mixed with horror fiction and eroticism, usually based around a killer whose identity is revealed at the end of the movie. One could say that Psycho and Peeping Tom were direct influences to giallo films, especially the visual style of Peeping Tom predating the subgenre. Visually, giallo films have a specific style of using surreal colors to create dreamlike atmospheres. Voyeurism, zoom-ins on people's eyes, disorienting framing, and graphic stylized violence. Giallo movies aren't necessarily the best works of cinema, and a lot of them don't age very well. The films are infamously dubbed over even in Italian so they can reach a wider spread of audiences, making the dialogue never quite match the actors' mouths.
Care for a coffee?
Ah, thanks, I would. In fact, it's just what I need. I've been up all night.
The movies would have actors and actresses perform in their native tongues and then dub those over in order to appeal to a wider audience. And so if you're watching an Italian film and feel like the mouths don't match up, your mind isn't playing tricks on you, that's just the way Italian films were made.
What do you think about before you fall asleep? My father.
Capirai, io invece se penso a tuo padre è proprio la volta che non dormo più. You mind if I watch TV?
Add in some splashes of color, a mysterious killer, brutal deaths, and lots and lots and lots of zoom-ins on people's eyes, and you've got a giallo movie. This type of film is incredibly influential on the horror genre because of its radical amount of stylization, and it's a precursor to the slasher subgenre as they use these mysterious murderers to kill off their characters. Very prominent Italian directors would lend their hand into this giallo subgenre like Dario Argento, Mario Bava, Sergio Martino, and Lucio Fulci.
That is Herschel Gordon Lewis. He's the ultimate master of horror.
Please. Dario Argento is so the ultimate master of horror.
Argento? He's all right.
Although not considered a giallo film for its supernatural plot, Suspiria is a perfect representation of 70s Italian horror by showing these fantastical, terrifying images. Bright red blood almost like paint, reminiscent of Hammer films, long hallways with tall rooms to elaborate on these gothic settings, and repeating color patterns makes watching Suspiria give you a sense of dread in this nightmarish dreamscape. The expressionism of using bright splashes of red, blue, green, and yellow for these surreal scenes helped elevate the movie's more visceral parts into something fear-inducing. The movie famously strikes inspiration for its color palette from Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, with these colorful settings for morbid scenes. I know that I'm gonna get crucified for this, but I'm gonna be honest, I am not a fan of Suspiria. I mean, like, I'm okay with it. It's just like not my favorite Argento movie. I think that the movie has amazing art direction, but its narrative makes almost no sense at all. It's beautifully shot and one of the last films that used Technicolor, so on that merit alone, it should be viewed at least once for any horror fan. Plus, the soundtrack for Goblin is just awesome. But really, I prefer the sequel to Suspiria, Inferno, so much more because it's just as visually striking, but has a way more coherent narrative. In fact, I actually enjoy Argento's other films more than I enjoy Suspiria, like Deep Red, Tenebrae, Bird of the Crystal Plumage, Phenomena, and Opera. I still think that Suspiria is visually fantastic and its influence can't be understated, and if you enjoy Suspiria and like dreamy trance-like films, I recommend watching the Japanese movie House, released in 1977, the same year as Suspiria. Much like Suspiria, the plot doesn't make much sense, and it's such a strange movie, but it's also so strange that I love it with all my heart. I'm not going to explain it because I honestly don't think it's possible, but the soundtrack slaps so hard. Visually, the movie is fantastical. Its graphics are so out there that it kind of just adds to its charm, and oddly enough, it was also co-written by the director's 10-year-old daughter, which I suppose is one of the reasons why the characters feel like it was written by a child. If you enjoy things like analog horror, this is right up your alley, and I just can't gush about this movie enough, even though by all accounts, I should hate it, I just can't get it out of my head. Italian horror and the giallo subgenre heavily influenced the slasher genre of the 1980s, but it's also been referenced in more modern films. Kill Bill Volume 1, for example, calls upon imagery from these films, and Tarantino even goes as far as to use the song Seven Black Notes from the movie Murder in the Seven Notes of Black by Lucio Fulci. The scene in Death Proof where stuntman Mike takes pictures of his victims is a direct reference to the killer in The Bird of the Crystal Plumage. Even movies like Scream use these giallo films as an influence for its black-gloved killer of Ghostface. The slasher subgenre is one of the largest and most popular of the horror genre, identified by its high body count, use of sex, drugs, alcohol, and violence. Based around a final girl using a female virgin who has to overcome the killer in the film's climax. Black Christmas, directed by Bob Clark, who would go on to direct A Christmas Story, is by all accounts one of the greatest of the subgenre, and I recommend any fan of horror movies to revisit it if you've seen it already, and if you're new to the genre, to give it a shot. The movie follows a sorority house during Christmas break being stalked by a stranger who harasses them over the phone before murdering them. An idea later replicated to popularity in 1996 with Wes Craven's Scream, although the killer in Black Christmas called with a more profane use of harassment.
I'll stick my tongue up your pretty pussy. You fucking creep.
Throughout the film, the women at the sorority get picked off one by one as the stranger continually harasses them with these strange phone calls. For such a simple plot, the movie feels pretty advanced for its time, with its interesting camera work predating Halloween, along with the themes and topics that it explores. For example, the lead protagonist is pregnant and confides in her boyfriend that she wants an abortion. Already, it's a pretty progressive topic and really stands the test of time as she argues with her boyfriend on how she doesn't want to keep the baby while he objectifies her by trying to force her to have the child and become domesticated.
And I told you about some of the things that I wanted to do. I still want to do those things. You can't ask me to drop everything I've been working for and give up all my ambitions because your plans have changed. Be realistic. I can't marry you.
Sure you can. What does it change?
Although it's not very graphic and is pretty tame for a modern viewing, Black Christmas stands the test of time and its influence reaches farther than you would think. For example, the movie opens up with this shot of a sorority house during Christmas and moves into a tracking POV shot of our killer, a sequence replicated in the 1978 classic that revolutionized the genre.
I met this 6-year-old child with this blank, pale, emotionless face and the blackest eyes, the devil's eyes.
At this point, what isn't there that can be said about this movie that really hasn't already been said? Halloween is a horror classic not because it's particularly scary to a modern day audience, but because of how inventive and progressive the movie is with its low budget. What really sets the movie apart is the soundtrack, which really helps elevate the film, becoming one of the most recognized motion picture soundtracks ever created. With the growing popularity of the synthesizer and electronic music in the 70s and 80s, it really defined the soundtrack of horror films at the time. This is a big reason as to why I enjoy 70s and 80s Italian horror, because the music just slaps like Halloween's soundtrack. John Carpenter's Halloween was filmed on a budget of $300,000 and couldn't afford to have an orchestra or studio compose the film's score. Instead, inspired by the Exorcist soundtrack and music from the band Goblin, Carpenter created the movie's iconic Halloween soundtrack on his own in the span of 3 days, while the film was shot in exactly 20 days. Just looking at the ground filled with dead leaves when the trees are visibly green and healthy really adds to its charm. The Halloween requel in 2018 actually pays homage to this by replicating the same look. When you compare both Halloween and Black Christmas to each other, the films have such similar qualities it's hard to not point them out. In fact, Bob Clark even stated that when he was talking to John Carpenter, who loved Black Christmas, Carpenter asked if Clark was going to make a sequel to it, which he wasn't, and Clark said it would be the next year and the guy would have actually been caught, escape from a mental institution, go back to the house, and they would start all over again, and I would call it Halloween. That's not to say or confirm that Carpenter took the idea from Clark at all. They're both amazing directors, and the movies really just couldn't be further apart. However, interestingly enough, although Halloween popularized the slasher genre, the tropes you would come to know of the subgenre wouldn't become cemented until the 1980s when the horror genre exploded. By the time that the 80s rolled around, technological advances finally caught up with horror. Movies were more visually visceral, and special effects became the forefront of films with gore and schlock. Where the 70s had movies that showed little to no gore, the 80s were filled with as much as you could handle, sometimes a little too much. So much so that the British Board of Film Censors cracked down on their bans, resulting in what's called the Video Nasties. This was a collection of low-budget horror films that the BBFC gave authorities as a guideline of what movies were banned from Britain, containing films such as The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Cannibal Holocaust, The Last House on the Left, Inferno, Zombie, and The Evil Dead. Although not every movie was banned from the UK in the Video Nasties list, the BBFC would publish more lists to add on to the Video Nasties as films that could be confiscated or destroyed by officers of the law. Movies like Maniac would be banned for cinemas in 1981, again in 1998, released with 58 seconds of cuts in 2002, and was only released uncut in 2022.
There was so much shock, gore, and exploitation in the 80s of horror films, and the advent of VHS made it difficult to control what was being put out at the time, and one franchise helped make it all the more difficult.
Well, if that's the way you feel, forget it, Vic. Just forget it. But I think you're really out of line.
Sean Cunningham, one of the co-producers of The Last House on the Left, directed the 1980 film Friday the 13th, one of the longest-running horror franchises of all time. Made to capitalize on the hype of Halloween, Cunningham reportedly took an ad out in a newspaper to sell a movie with just the name Friday the 13th and no script to back it up.
And Sean called me up and said, Halloween is making incredible money at the box office, let's rip it off. That is keeping it real.
Luckily for Cunningham, the movie was a giant success, and by 1990, the franchise would have 8 installments, releasing almost every single year during the decade.
Jason Voorhees would become a horror movie icon, one of the first along with Michael Myers and Freddy Krueger since the Universal Monster Classics, to the point where it would be more difficult to find someone that doesn't know who he is. And with a lot of horror movie franchises, the original movie is usually the best. However, Friday the 13th is not one of those cases. I think it's actually insane how bad the first Friday the 13th actually is. There's really no effective scares throughout the whole movie besides the startling ending where Jason comes out of the water, and that's it. Also, God bless Tom Savini, the effects are awesome. Jason isn't even in the first film until then, and Mrs. Voorhees is such a flat character that you just don't care about her at all. The acting isn't necessarily good, the story isn't necessarily groundbreaking, and its cinematography isn't anything to write home about. It's just a sleazy 80s slasher film, and that's really the charm of the movies.
The Friday the 13th franchise is best described as a sum of its parts and not necessarily about its individual pieces. Its predecessors in Halloween, Psycho, Black Christmas, and Peeping Tom were a lot more classy and put the story first instead of focusing on the death scenes. Friday the 13th went in the opposite direction and instead filled the movies with these terrible, unlikable teenage characters to the point where you begin rooting for Jason to come in and wreak havoc.
The Friday the 13th movies are very comforting to me, so I'm a bit biased on these films. Personally, I think that the movies don't hit their stride until part 4 during the Tommy Jarvis arc, and onwards where they kind of just go sicko mode, like Jason X is mwah. I actually recommend most people watch the remake of the Friday the 13th from 2009 because it sums up parts 1 through 3 so well, and so then that way you don't have to watch them, and it's significantly better than its originals. The franchise is just so cheesy and fun that you can't help but enjoy their ridiculousness, like in part 4 where there's a death scene where the character just starts shouting, "He's killing me!" Part 7 where he fights someone with telekinetic powers. Part 6 where Tommy just accidentally reanimates Jason and the second he wakes up he just chooses violence. Part 8 has some of the most brutal killings, and seeing Jason in Times Square is just worth every penny in my opinion, even if a majority of the movie takes place on a boat. Also, just watching Jason's costume slowly deteriorate over the course of the movies is so much fun, with his mask becoming like damaged, broken, and gross by the 8th film. It's just all mindless fun made to entertain with no other meanings behind it, and that's something that I can really appreciate sometimes. Commercial horror films in the 80s were flooded with these large slasher franchises like Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, and Halloween.
Child's Play would release in 1988, but its franchise wouldn't really grow until the 90s when its sequels began to be released more frequently, much the same vein as Hellraiser. Other smaller slasher franchises would also fill up the horror genre roster during the 80s with movies like Sleepaway Camp and Silent Night Deadly Night, which would garner cult followings within the horror community. The slasher genre would be packed with terrible additions that were made to just make quick money from studios, which is what led to a huge backlash from censors because they were made so quickly and cheaply with a fast turnaround time to flood the market, especially when direct-to-video films became a lot more common during the mid-80s. These films would capitalize on nudity and gore as their main focus of the movie, with these provocative VHS covers that entice people to watch them.
We certainly saw in 1982 a series of videos which depicted mutilation, it depicted death, it depicted violence, which we felt enough was enough and took action to stop the growing spread of this form of violence.
This one is the controversial Evil Dead, and this one, perhaps more horrific, is a film called The Entity in a coffin-shaped box. It's about repeated rape by a brutal force.
These particular type of video nasties are certainly very degrading to women. I also believe very firmly that they must have some effect on a certain small section of our community.
The minister who was speaking here at the Department of Justice also said he believed these videos had a direct bearing on some of the more violent crimes that had been committed, especially crimes against women.
However, during this time of schlock, there were a lot of hidden gems that lurked within its poopy depths that would later gain a cult following, such as Maniac, April Fool's Day, My Bloody Valentine, The Prowler, and Slumber Party Massacre, just to name a few.
Just one little beer. Courtney, you're underage. Negative, but come on, let's go.
After creating The Hills Have Eyes in '77, Wes Craven would return to the genre in 1984 in his new film that turned your dreams into terrifying dreamscapes with A Nightmare on Elm Street.
Nancy? What, Mother? Don't fall asleep in there.
A Nightmare on Elm Street really does a great job of encapsulating everything about the 80s, but turning it into a more visceral and supernatural experience while still riding the tropes of the slasher genre.
84's Nightmare compared to the 80s Friday the 13th is such a huge difference in cinema when you compare the two slasher films together, even though, Nightmare never reached the same franchise height as Friday the 13th did. Although most slasher films during this time took a more realism-based approach to their films akin to what giallo movies did, Nightmare on Elm Street went with a more surrealist approach to the slasher subgenre, adding in these supernatural elements to progress the story, which is what really separates itself from the rest of the movies in the genre. There's actually been a recent trend in slasher films that have begun to follow in Nightmare on Elm Street steps by adding in surreal or supernatural elements into their movies that other more realism-based slashers don't tread into. The Fear Street trilogy uses supernatural elements in their slasher-based storyline. Terrifier 2 turns Art the Clown into a supernatural being with connections to demonic entities. Happy Death Day uses a supernatural occurrence to tell its time-looping story. And Freaky adds a supernatural ritual to add onto its slasher-based story with a body swap. When it comes to slasher franchises, A Nightmare on Elm Street is definitely one of the better ones, with Wes Craven even returning with a new Nightmare in 1994 that's pretty much a rough draft for his later film Scream, with its meta-commentary on horror films.
And I did feel like an assassin. I would load up my car with my tools and go some strange place and kill people, And the teenagers loved it. Like in Friday the 13th, the teenagers would come up and going, how am I gonna die? They were so excited about how they were gonna die. And the juicier the better, the gorier the better.
One of the biggest proponents to horror films during the 80s was its embracement of special effects, and three artists would rise to the occasion as the most influential special effects artists of their time: Tom Savini, Rob Bottin, and Rick Baker. Tom Savini had already broken into the film industry special effects department thanks to his innovative effects in George Romero's 1978 classic Dawn of the Dead and the original Friday the 13th, but his pinnacle of work comes from his return to the zombie subgenre in the 1985 film Day of the Dead, bringing his signature style of vivid realism to the genre. Day of the Dead special effects put his earlier work on Dawn of the Dead to shame with these insanely graphic effects that still live up to this day. Creating a name for himself starting with movies like The Prowler and Maniac, Savini's work would become more apparent through commercial films like 1982's Creepshow, and now leads his own special effects program at the Douglas Education Center in Pennsylvania. Rick Baker would also become a household name for special effects artists with his work from An American Werewolf in London.
I didn't mean to call you meatloaf, Jack!
He's responsible for the effects of the Cronenberg classic Videodrome, Men in Black, The Ring, and How the Grinch Stole Christmas. His apprentice Rob Bottin would also lend his hand in helping to revolutionize practical special effects in films, starting with The Howling, which appeared 5 months before An American Werewolf in London, where Rick Baker also has a similar transformation scene since they were both working on the same kind of effect together. One of his most notable pieces of work comes from John Carpenter's 1982 cult classic.
Clear!
Clear.
Released in 1982, The Thing came out with a whimper with negative reviews from critics for its excessive use of body horror special effects. At the time of its release, the film's concepts of paranoia, isolation, and groupthink added with mind-blowing special effects and a slow burn went completely over audiences' heads and was constantly compared to science fiction movies released at the time like Alien, E.T., and Blade Runner. Much like many horror films, critics openly bashed the movie and immediately disregarded it as any form of art.
I think that's probably an understatement. I would call this the barf bag movie of July. I have some problems with it. One of them is, I think, the characters. They're not made into three-dimensional people. Their function is to walk down the corridor and be jumped on. The other thing is plausibility. Once they figure out that this thing can turn into one of them, they ought to institute a watertight buddy system, but instead they have all kinds of loopholes. People walk out into the snow, come back with a grin on their face, so that the story is totally implausible, and the movie just basically is an excuse for this very gruesome and repellent creature to gross us out. It is the most nauseating thing I've ever seen on a movie screen, I think.
That's quite a statement.
I think I'll stand behind it.
I think
the film's technical achievements and special effects were taken as visually repulsive and excessive by critics, leading to the movie being torn to shreds over the immediate years of its release. It even led to Carpenter losing his job of directing the 1984 film Firestarter because of how poorly the thing performed. The poor performance also prompted Universal Pictures to buy out Carpenter from his multiple motion picture deal with the company.
The critically acclaimed failure of The Thing actually considerably lowered Carpenter's confidence, with both audience members and critics openly bashing the film with scathing reviews. It wasn't until the movie found its audience on home video that The Thing became regarded as one of the greatest horror films of all time. And as we've seen throughout this video, this is a very common practice that critics did with horror movies that are now universally considered as culturally impactful and significant films.
Here's Johnny!
On release, The Shining was also a critically acclaimed failure and is one of the only films of Stanley Kubrick that was not mentioned for an Academy Award. Stephen King openly despised the film, which was a huge deal at the time considering how much weight his words had on Western media. Although the film and the book are drastically different art forms, it really cannot be denied that Kubrick was out to make his own movie and not an adaptation of the famous Stephen King novel. Still, The Shining is a masterclass of psychological horror that transcends time, being as good as it is even with a modern-day viewing. Much like Misery and The Thing's setting, The Shining uses snow to isolate these characters and then adds in this supernatural house of horrors and a slow burn of tension that builds throughout the film. The hotel becomes its own character in the movie, feeling as alive as Jack Nicholson and Shelley Duvall. For example, Kubrick implements these wide shots and closed corridors to present the hotel's oppression, making the hallways feel almost endless. Exit signs are plastered all throughout the film to show the urgency of the family needing to escape the hotel's grasp. Chandeliers are constantly shown subtly above characters' heads to perpetuate this looming dread. Kubrick consistently breaks the rule of thirds when showing characters by, instead of placing the actors within the frame of thirds, he purposefully places them into the literal center of the frame, causing the viewer to feel dread with how much emptiness is shown on the screen, leading to further visual isolation. This same visual concept is actually adopted in Jordan Peele's latest film, Nope, showcasing these characters in these barren landscapes, isolated and surrounded by this dread represented by the vast emptiness of their location. A frame within a frame is also constantly used throughout the movie. Symmetrical composition is accomplished using a single point perspective, making the viewer uneasy with its uncanny valley representation of reality. To help better understand the use of these techniques, first let's talk about the single point perspective, also known as the one point perspective or vice versa. Most commonly associated with photography and painting, it's the concept of objects relative to your perspective with a vanishing point. One of the earliest renditions of this is The Last Supper from Leonardo da Vinci. We have the vanishing point of the horizon with Jesus' head displayed in the middle. This gives us a one-point perspective where our eyes are immediately drawn to the center of the frame. You can also see what's called leading lines from the ceiling and the side decor to subtly push your gaze towards the center of the frame. This was also the defining moment before Jesus was crucified, giving the image a foreboding sense of feeling. However, this is a still painting, and film is different with the addition of movement. Kubrick uses this one-point perspective in almost every movie he makes to give off a foreboding sense of anxiety by having his viewers be attracted towards a single point on the screen. However, this sense of foreboding atmosphere happens when you add in the addition of movement, but then remove that movement, which then perpetuates anxiety. We are fixed on this area and expect movement from either characters or the camera, and while we wait for this to happen, it creates a buildup of anxiety through an uncanny valley perspective of reality. Forcing viewers to focus on the center of the screen to highlight the importance of the subject or to give off feelings of uneasiness, and sometimes he uses all of these aspects in the same shot to layer the tension of the scene. By all accounts, The Shining is a very loud movie and uses both diegetic and non-diegetic sounds to entice panic, fear, isolation, and confusion. Diegetic audio is sound that is placed within the context of the story and able to be heard by characters. In this scene, we can hear the loud and ominous sound of Jack tossing a tennis ball against the hotel's wall, inducing a sense of fear with the character and setting, while giving the hotel more of a physical presence in the film. In the scene where Danny rides the tricycle through the hotel, we have diegetic sounds of the tricycle being muffled by the carpet, interrupted by these loud stabs of sound when the wheels hit the hardwood floor. When Jack and Wendy are speaking to each other in this giant room of the hotel, notice how much they pause in between their exchange.
Don't be so grouchy.
I'm not being grouchy. I just want to finish my work.
Okay, I understand.
The echo of their conversation at the end of their sentences further pushes not only the family's isolation from the outside world, but also the separation of the relationship between Wendy and Jack. These are all tools that Kubrick used throughout his filmography and are used by modern-day directors like Wes Anderson, who uses the concept of symmetry on a regular basis. As horror slashers and movies far ahead of their time were released in theaters, the horror genre saw a huge boom in the 80s. However, independent horror became more accessible as a new form of home media began to grow at a rapid pace.
Keep fogging, and when I yell for it, then stop it. Fog it. Stop!
Most horror films are about people being picked off, but, you know, Evil Dead is essentially about one actor being picked on, you know, and it's kind of like Sam, you know, antagonizing his best friend from school.
In 1978, two longtime friends by the name of Bruce Campbell and Sam Raimi went out into the woods with a couple of their friends in Marshall, Michigan, to create the short film Within the Woods. The proof of concept to gain interest with investors, and in 1981, they released the groundbreaking feature film, The Evil Dead. A cabin hidden away in the woods, a book inked in blood and bound with human flesh, a tape recorder recollecting horrific events and summoning an evil entity hell-bent on dragging you and your friends into the deepest depths of hell. The Evil Dead and its sequels, The Evil Dead 2 and Army of Darkness, became cult classics lauded as some of the best horror cinema has to offer. The Evil Dead's placement onto the Video Nasties list gave the film even more publicity when it reached the home video market and garnered more favorable reviews as time went on. The story of Sam and Bruce creating this film, this like phenomena of cinema, is basically the filmmaker's equivalent of a fairy tale. Just a couple of kids with nothing but their ambitions and dedication going through long months of this grueling work to create this cinematic wonder. Whenever you get the chance, I highly recommend listening to some of the commentary on the Evil Dead franchise and just hearing about all the innovative camera work that they accomplished on a shoestring budget, all of the special effects, there's even like stop motion. It's really astounding. I could literally talk for hours about the franchise. I mean, when I first watched the movie when I was like 15, it completely blew me away because really there's absolutely nothing like the Evil Dead, even to this day. The franchise is one of the most beloved horror film franchises to ever bless the genre with its blend of slapstick comedy as an appreciation of the Three Stooges from Raimi and Bruce, along with the splatploitation or splatter subgenre that it helped pioneer as movies with a lot of gross liquids and bodily dismemberment. Movies like Brain Dead and Reanimator heavily lean into this subgenre as a comedic form of cinema.
Party's over.
The 80s were a boom for horror films as commercial movies constantly hit theaters and independent horror began to grow on VHS as we move into the 90s, where video stores like Blockbuster and Hollywood Video made these films more easily obtainable for moviegoers, as well as the advent of television where the films could be shown on cable to a new generation of film watchers.
Before winter has you floored in what it is.
My girlfriend sucked 37 dicks.
Now this is pod racing.
The 90s paved the way to the advent of the internet, television, and in terms of horror, was burned out towards the end of the 80s. The 90s marked the end of both the millennia and century, where surprisingly, a lot of children's horror and horror on television became more prominent. Horror TV shows aimed at children became extremely common, with Tales from the Crypt Keeper, a children's spin-off of Tales from the Crypt on HBO, which was a household success on television, bringing horror onto the small screen. Are You Afraid of the Dark also attacked children with uncomfortable imagery. Goosebumps not only became a young adult's favorite book series, but its TV show also attempted to scare and frighten children with these fun ghost stories. Cartoons such as Courage the Cowardly Dog and All Real Monsters brought these ideas of horrific events and turned them into comedic ones, even though they had very disturbing scenes that young watchers remember all too well. Being born in '91, these shows are very important to me because they're what made me interested in the horror genre. I don't even know why this was a huge trend in the 90s and couldn't find information that draws a direct line of why the occurrence happened, but if I had to guess, it was probably because of how popular R.L. Stine books were for children at the time, and so TV studios wanted to capitalize on it. The Halloween specials of TV shows became my favorite episodes, like Boy Meets World, where they're trapped inside of their school with a masked killer.
Our soon-to-be first victim. Me? Why me? Well, Kenny, it's certainly not going to be any of us. What are you doing?
And, The Simpsons Treehouse of Horrors was always something that I looked forward to every October. Even Disney released a considerable amount of horror films aimed at children, like Hocus Pocus, Halloween Town, and Don't Look Under the Bed. A film that parents thought was too frightening for children, and so Disney pulled the movie out of its October circulation by 2006.
Do you think I look a little strange?
Starting with Salem's Lot in 1979, Stephen King novels also received televised movie adaptations or miniseries which plagued people's minds in the 90s, like Misery Scene of hobbling Paul Sheldon or the nightmare-inducing images of It starring Tim Curry. Outside of television, audience members became a lot more tired of the genre because of the large influx of cheap commercial slasher films from the 80s and needed new life breathed into the genre.
A census taker once tried to test me. I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti.
Silence of the Lambs, released in 1991, was the first horror film to receive an Academy Award for Best Picture. However, the Academy Awards hate horror films, and so the movie was purposefully marketed as a thriller instead of a horror film to increase its chances of winning awards. Orion Pictures even went as far as to prohibit Fangoria magazine a chance to cover the movie out of fear it would be deemed as a horror film, fearing that the movie would be disregarded during that year's season of the Academy with the increase of slanderous critiques of the genre. Obviously, I am very biased to this opinion because I think that's complete horseshit. Any film that reaches some kind of Academy recognition, even when the films are supposed to elicit thoughts of fear and dread, are then somehow turned into thrillers over time because of these negative, connotations of the horror genre. And usually I don't enjoy categorizing, forcing movies into different genres because it's pretty silly to, force movies into these different categories. However, the treatment of horror films throughout motion picture history is fucking frustrating with how elitist Academy Awards are towards the genre. I wouldn't be surprised if in 10 or 20 years Get Out would also no longer be considered a horror film.
Well, I'm getting ready to watch a video.
Really? What?
Oh, just some scary movie.
You like scary movies?
Uh-huh.
What's your favorite scary movie?
I don't know.
You have to have a favorite. What comes to mind?
Wes Craven returned to the horror genre once again with Scream in 1996, becoming an instant hit and reviving a genre that had grown tired and repetitive, while also being an ode to the horror films of the past, even if it can be a little on the nose.
Not your friend.
Scream is the perfect introductory horror film and is always my go-to for recommending movies of the genre to people who are interested in horror films. First off, it has an astounding opening scene that's one of the best cold opens to a movie period. Not only are we pulled into this story with a character that a modern-day audience can connect with in the first 12 minutes, it sets up the rest of the plot of the film. What Scream does really well is that it really brings a lot of love to the genre by using elements from past films and bringing them back to life, like the harassing phone calls from Black Christmas, while elevating the genre to new heights.
We all go a little mad sometimes.
No, Billy!
The follow-up to the original with Scream 2 also holds very iconic scenes in the franchise and subverts expectations of these legacy characters by putting them in real danger instead of skirting around the topic. Where the original Scream sets up the audience's and genre fans' love for the character Randy, it makes his death in the sequel all that more impactful, showing audiences that no one in the franchise is safe while also becoming a masterclass in building tension around these beloved characters.
Why are you even here, Randy? You'll never be the leading man.
Fuck you!
Dissecting the scene, we see three legacy characters in Randy, Gale, and Dewey being joined by Gale's new cameraman, Joel. In the scene of Randy's demise, we notice all of these safety nets for these characters that become visually unraveled throughout the scene. It's set in broad daylight, a safe setting for the characters to not be murdered. The characters are all surrounded by other people in a public setting. The characters are together, providing more of their safety in numbers. Joel, a new character, is set into the scene as a buffer for the audience so that if something bad did happen, he's there to fill in the bloodshed instead of our legacy characters in Randy, Gale, and Dewey. First, Joel leaves after the three begin discussing the recent murders, removing the buffer character from these legacy characters and putting them within harm's reach. When the killer calls to harass the characters, they realize that they're being watched, and so they separate to try and capture the killer, which then unravels another layer to the audience's safety net. Visually, Randy's character becomes more isolated as this seemingly safe public setting with innocent people becomes a place of likely suspects. Shots of the news van, or Randy's place of death, are seen very sparingly until we reach the climax of the scene. And to finally close out the sequence when Randy is taken into the news van to be murdered by the killer, we see people walking past the van in broad daylight as Randy is stabbed to death, showing audiences that public places in broad daylight aren't sure tickets of survival. What's so endearing about the 1996 Scream is that it actively tells you the rules, while simultaneously breaking them, deconstructing not only the genre, but also itself.
You can never drink or do drugs.
never say who's there. Don't you watch scary movies? It's a death wish.
Number one, you can never have sex.
No, it's just, what's the point? They're all the same. Some stupid killer stalking some big-breasted girl who can't act, who's always running up the stairs when she should be going out the front door. It's insulting.
Never, ever, ever, under any circumstances, say, I'll be right back. Because you won't be back.
I'm getting another beer. You want one?
Yeah, sure.
I'll be right back!
Scream is a very important part of the horror genre because it really helped elevate the movies that came after it to create more dynamic and interesting characters instead of just sending random stereotypical people out to the slaughter. A movie that really encompasses this new age of intelligent characters is Robert Rodriguez's 1998 film The Faculty.
Written by Kevin Williamson, the same writer for the film Scream and Dawson's Creek, The Faculty pits a group of high school kids against an alien race that can take over the bodies of any living creature, much like Invasion of the Body Snatchers or The Thing. However, the characters are fully aware of the genre. What makes The Faculty stand out among the slasher revival of the 90s like I Know What You Did Last Summer, Halloween H2O, and Urban Legends is that the characters are written pretty well with a star-studded cast of Josh Arnett, Jordana Brewster, Elijah Wood, Salma Hayek, Robert Patrick, and even a young Usher. For the most part, the main characters make smart decisions and are intelligent, like Josh Arnett's character of a sleazy drug dealer who also understands anatomy and chemistry. Elijah Wood's character is a nerdy school photographer who isn't just killed off to up the body count and steps into more of a leader role in the group. Although the movie can look hokey with its outdated CGI during its climax, the film still holds up extremely well with a modern-day viewing. These more elevated characters and stories can also be seen in the 1992 film Candyman, another horror film created and based on the mind of Clive Barker, who wrote and directed Hellraiser, based off of his novella, The Hellbound Heart.
The story is quite short, it's quite brief. And it was set in Liverpool, which was Clive's hometown, and we changed the setting to Chicago in the USA. When I went to Chicago and I researched housing projects in Chicago, and I came across the notorious Cabrini Green housing development. And then, of course, Candyman became an African American, so that gave the whole film a very different tone to the way the original story was, which was basically about poor Liverpudlians in housing projects.
Candyman, based on the short story The Forbidden by Clive Barker, is a supernatural and psychological horror film centered around the idea of how the mythical belief of characters and monsters are what gives them strength. This is the same idea that Freddy Krueger is basically based off of, where he needs people to believe in him in order to even exist, and the lack of this fear is what drains him of his power. Mixing this urban decay of low-income housing along with the mysticism of Candyman, played by the amazing Tony Todd, is what sends this film into a higher status.
The 90s were a turning point in black representation in horror films, with movies like Wes Craven's The People Under the Stairs, Candyman, and Tales from the Hood implementing better representation of people of color compared to the slasher films of the 80s that casted people of color into side roles and marginalized them. However, in the 90s, horror films became more inclusive, tackling these ideas of police brutality,
Motherfucker, are you out of your damn mind?
racist politicians, and the black fear of white spaces.
I was recently listening to the commentary of Bernard Rose and Tony Todd on the film and found this specific piece interesting.
It's very easy to do, to come up behind somebody and go boo, and make a loud noise, and they'll all go, ow. And it's easier now than it was then because the sound systems have improved. Back then you couldn't really do it because when you were dealing with the kind of sound systems that were available on a 35mm print with a Dolby mix, you couldn't actually make somebody jump with the sound alone. So,
right. But now the whole sound is like, you can make every creak.
I don't know if this has any form of basis, however, it's an interesting theory that makes a lot of sense and a topic that I'd like to look into further in the future. Although the title Tales from the Hood from 1995 sounds like the film would be a Wayans Brothers parody, the movie is actually a sophisticated anthology film that tackled problematic concepts within the African American community. Each story focused on topics such as police corruption, domestic abuse, racism, and gang violence.
not afraid of the ghosts.
Well, the only spooks I'm afraid of are you spooky reporters.
However, the movie was poorly marketed, leading to the film doing horribly in theaters, but gained a cult following throughout the years and is now recognized as an early adopter of social commentary for African Americans in the horror genre. Takashi Miike would also make his mark in the horror genre, helping to influence the 2000s trend of brutality and gore with the Japanese film Audition, released in 1999. Based on the book of the same name, Audition takes two extremes and jams them together to create a stark contrast between the two. A blossoming love story abruptly ended with these horrifying bodily dismemberments. Along with Ichi the Killer, an extremely gruesome action crime film, Audition was one of the largest influences for Eli Roth to create Hostel in 2005 and helped usher in this new dawn of extreme gore. As independent horror saw an influx in the genre due to VHS, television, and towards the end of the 90s, the creation of DVDs, no movie really encapsulates the time of home media like the 1999 classic found footage horror film.
Stars the movie everyone seems to be talking about these days. It's the Blair Witch Project. Critics have called it one of the scariest films of all time. Take a quick look.
I am so sorry for everything that has happened.
The Blair Witch Project, released in 1999, helped popularize the found footage subgenre dating back to Cannibal Holocaust, another video nasty with graphic scenes of animal cruelty. Found footage films try to blur this line between reality and fiction, giving us these stories of seemingly real scenarios with the camera acting as a window for the audience. And while some films like to visually show their scares and villains, the Blair Witch Project practices in the art of what you don't see is scarier than what you do.
Oh, Go, fucking go!
Found footage films helped filmmakers break into the industry by utilizing the advent of digital cameras to decrease cost while keeping the cast small to spend as little money as possible to create something terrifying to movie watchers. Marketed as a real documentary to the point of having missing posters for the actors pop up as part of the marketing campaign, the Blair Witch Project garnered enough attention and media coverage to become one of the highest grossing films to ever exist. Much like the marketing campaign for Cloverfield, creators of the movie even launched a website dedicated to the mythos of the Blair Witch in order to help sell the film. Although movies like Cannibal Holocaust predated the Blair Witch Project in terms of found footage movies, the Blair Witch Project was the one that popularized the subgenre. Released in 1999, the movie would spark the idea of other found footage films going into the 2000s with movies like Paranormal Activity that became commercialized into a franchise. Released on the cusp of digital cameras instead of film, which was a huge paywall for filmmakers considering how much extra capital you needed to raise just to purchase celluloid and processing, along with having an office space to manually splice the film together on a flatbed, unless you are working with a company with, enough resources to use digital non-linear editing software like Avid Media Composer, which was the first non-linear editing program, or NLE program, ever created. Technology started to catch up with the industry, allowing more filmmakers to join instead of it being strictly for the elite, as NLE programs became more easily accessible, and digital cameras started to become an accepted medium for creating feature-length films.
Are you Piccolo? Did you kill my grandfather? It's a thong!
You are tearing me apart, Lisa!
By the 21st century, horror films had begun to evolve and search for new ways to elevate the scares in the genre. Gore was more pronounced and brutal, films became gritty, and remakes to popular franchises began to flood the commercial market. The independent scene would continue to grow throughout the 2000s as digital media became more widely accepted in the industry, and NLE programs allowed filmmakers to bring their films to life without having to rely on big studios. The 2000s of horror films get a bad rap because of just how much bad commercial horror motion pictures were coming out at the time, and hating remakes and prequels was the cool thing. However, I find the decade to be extremely fascinating because of the advent of digital cameras becoming more popular, like the Canon XL1 and DSLR cameras, the stabilization of the internet, and the growth of independent horror. It was a big deal at the time when movies were released when they were edited on NLE programs outside of Avid Media Composer, and it wasn't until more recently that Adobe Premiere has become a more accepted NLE program in the industry. However, a majority of films are still created on Avid Media Composer.
Hey everybody, this is Eddie Hamilton. I'm the editor on Top Gun Maverick, and this is my Avid Timeline tour.
So my Avid Timeline usually starts out with either a storyboard or some kind of previs.
And today we will be looking at a sample of my Avid Timeline from episode 3.
We are looking at a sample of our timeline from the Avid. This is one reel.
During the 2000s, films began to be edited by newer pro amateur software like Final Cut Pro, with films like The Social Network, 500 Days of Summer, and No Country for Old Men. It was a huge turning point for the independent film scene because of this new technology being more and more accessible to the general public. For horror films, the 2000s were filled with movies that are now seen as iconic and have become highly revered in the horror community. American Psycho has pretty much surpassed its cult classic label. The Strangers is very common to see in top 100 horror film lists. House of a Thousand Corpses is commonly referred to as Rob Zombie's best film. Let the Right One In is highly revered from both critics and audience members. Jennifer's Body has had a huge revival and is now an amazing representative of feminism in films. Shaun of the Dead has been dissected as a comedic masterpiece. Ginger Snaps is a great monstrous menstruation film. The 2000s oozed with great horror movies. Based on the 1998 Japanese horror film Ring-Yu, which is based on the novel of the same name, The Ring released in 2002 with a rating of PG-13, traumatizing preteens by having this be one of the first popular horror films that they would ever watch. When The Ring came out, I was 11 years old, right around the PG-13 borderline, and so I watched the movie at a relatively young age, and it scared the ever-living crap out of me. I still can't stand the sound and sight of TV static because of this movie. It was also a great gateway film into like Asian horror, like Ju-On the Grudge, Shudder, A Tale of Two Sisters, Audition, and Ichi the Killer. Normally, I don't enjoy it when Western media whitewashes their cast like with The Grudge in 2004 or Oldboy in 2013. However, I enjoy both versions of The Ring for different reasons and regard the American remake as the superior film, mostly because the main character, Naomi, is such a strong female lead and really pushes the investigation forward, unlike her Japanese counterpart who kind of lets her ex-husband take control of the situation. Although The Ring had little to no gore, the 2000s made up for it by displaying some of the most graphic special effects that would create a subgenre that plagued horror films for years.
I rang him and I pitched him the idea for the scene, you know, with the jaw trap. I'm like, it's gonna be great. We've got this woman and she wakes up strapped to this chair and she's got this steel trap on her face and there's a timer on it, and when it goes off, it's gonna split her face open, you know, and she has to find the key and it's hidden in someone's stomach. And, you know, but she manages to get it off just in time. And James is like, that's great. Put a creepy doll in there, it's perfect.
In 2004, James Wan released Saw as his directorial debut that sparked a franchise encompassing soon-to-be 10 films, making it the longest-running horror franchise created in the 21st century, and along with Hostel, would create the subgenre entitled torture porn. The Saw franchise is one that has been mistreated since its creation, with the amount of bad press that it got with the term torture porn, which is really just a smear campaign against the violence portrayed in the films. Saw 1 through 3 as a trilogy is incredibly enjoyable with some awesome special effects which stay practical for a majority of the franchise, and that alone is insane.
We got a designer friend of mine down in Melbourne to help me make that jaw trap. And Stuart, man, he was a crazy guy. He made that thing and he goes up to Lee and goes, hey man, you know, if I put a real bear trap spring in this, it could actually work. So, to which I replied, cool.
Some of the best parts about Saw is watching the behind the scenes on their DVDs about the making of these different traps and sequences for the movies. The ending of Saw 5's coffin trap is actually almost a fully functional death trap that the creators had to be incredibly careful not to hurt anybody with.
The metallic room was one of the biggest and most dangerous traps because that trap again was real like the rest of them. Those walls, the way we rigged them, you couldn't push them. They would crush you. They have that much force, that much pressure.
The first Saw is a solid horror mystery and really reflects the feeling of a post 9/11 world with this focus on realism, with a wicked twist at the end when John Kramer rises up from the ground with the Zepp overture in the background. It really blew my mind when I first saw it and made me fall in love with the franchise. Whether you love the movies or not, you can't talk about the 2000s of horror films without mentioning them, considering a new Saw film was released every year for 7 years. That's almost as consistent as Friday the 13th was in the 80s. Although not French, the films lean into the 2000s style of the new French extreme movement with their very depressing and graphic realism-based violence like High Tension and Martyrs.
That type of horror film, the visceral, gory stuff like Saw, Hostel, hadn't really been recognized by a mainstream audience. It had always been there, but it was always bubbling in the underground. It was more like heavy metal music or something. It was something that a passionate core of people loved, but the mainstream public weren't into. And I feel like at some point with everything, if it bubbles underground for long enough, eventually it rises to the surface for a while and has a peak. And that was around 2004 was the moment for that type of visceral horror film.
After seeing success with Juno in 2007, writer Diablo Cody would get the green light to write her next project, a horror film about a woman who eats boys called Jennifer's Body.
Maybe they're just boys. Morsels, we have all the power. Don't you know that these things, these are like smart bombs, okay? You point them in the right direction and shit gets real.
A high school cheerleader named Jennifer turns into a succubus after being mutilated and killed by a small town band so they could reach fame through a sacrificial ritual. When she returns from the dead, teenage boys begin to disappear as she lures them in to feast on their flesh and blood. Jennifer's Body is interesting because it's layered with themes of bisexuality and queerness, feminism, sexual empowerment, exploring these complex female relationships wrapped up in this 2000s time capsule.
Why don't you just come by my place tonight? I just got Aquamarine on DVD. It's about this girl who's like half sushi. I guess she has sex through a blowhole or something.
Posters of Fall Out Boy, Motion City soundtrack, tracks by All Time Low and Panic at the Disco, emo dressers. There's so much that people who grew up during the 2000s can relate to with the entire vibe of this movie. The writing from Diablo Cody bleeds with memorable quotes that I can't get out of my head, like,
Are you PMSing or something? PMS isn't real, Needy. It was invented by the boy-run media to make us seem crazy.
Released at the peak of Megan Fox's career, the film was poorly marketed to the wrong demographic, from studio heads trying to capitalize on the actress's body towards young boys and fans of Diablo Cody's previous work with Juno. Even when trying to push the marketing towards a different demographic, studio heads only cared about the representation of Megan Fox to sell the movie and didn't care for the actual substance of the film.
I got a very memorable email from a marketing person at the studio once, where I had sent him this articulate defense of the film, and here's how it should be marketed. And I said, what specifically are you thinking? And he wrote back, Megan Fox hot. 3 words.
For cutting a trailer together?
That
or
was
just for marketing
in terms
in
of
general?
In terms of what is the value of this film.
On release, the film was met with backlash from both critics and audience members as an occasionally clever dialogue, but the horror comic premise fails to be either funny or scary enough to satisfy. Jennifer's Body was bashed so heavily that the writer Diablo Cody separated herself from the film industry and had to go into therapy over the backlash of the movie. Just to appease studio heads at the time, one of the first scenes that they shot was of Megan Fox walking down the hallway in slow motion. Since its release, the film has finally found its market with a modern-day audience and has become a cultural icon for bisexuality due to the Me Too movement, which the film plays as a direct parallel with a group of men sacrificing a woman to their own personal gain.
It's pretty ridiculous how much commercial studios are so out of touch with reality, especially during the 2000s, that they would market a film with context exploring these very real representations of complex female relationships and bisexuality to a large demographic of 18 to 24-year-old frat boys just because Megan Fox is in the movie. It's what?
There was a test screening that a kid wrote. They said, what would you improve about this film? And the kid wrote, needs more boobs, and spelled boobs B-E-W-B-S. And that was the data that was collected and taken seriously by the people who were marketing the movie.
Jennifer's Body still sits at 5.4 on IMDb and has a rotten score from both critics and audience members of below 50%, and is probably one of the most mismarketed and misunderstood movies ever created. It's such a good dark comedy that's written and directed extremely well with relationships that feel real. Needy and Chip have a very caring and loving relationship, and seeing them have sex for the first time is one of the most relatable aspects of the movie.
I love this movie so much, and think that if you watch Juno and just couldn't connect with it, try picking up Jennifer's Body and seeing if it's something more up your alley.
The early 2000s also saw the release of Danny Boyle's Rage Virus film 28 Days Later, another movie in the horror genre that helped reimagine zombies. Although not technically a zombie film due to how those infected didn't eat flesh, the movie had a huge impact on the zombie subgenre to the point that it's now almost synonymous with the word zombies, and explaining that difference is more or less pedantic. By the 2000s, the idea of traditional zombies had become tired on the big screen. Instead of the slow-walking dread that Romero has started the trend of, zombies started to lean more into the comedic side of the genre.
Come in dispatch. Send more paramedics.
The only kind of media that still used zombies as a more horrific idea were the Resident Evil and House of the Dead video game franchises, which ended up being a huge influence on Danny Boyle's 28 Days Later. A highly contagious disease called the Rage Virus breaks out in Great Britain after a chimpanzee is freed from a laboratory. The virus spreads, becoming an epidemic resulting in the collapse of society, and 28 days later, a man named Jim wakes up from a coma and finds London deserted and overrun by fast-moving infected humans. Not only is 28 Days Later great with its shots of an abandoned London, it's also piqued a lot of my interest because of the way it was filmed using mini DV instead of 35mm print, making it one of the earliest adopters of digital video, along with Star Wars The Phantom Menace and The Blair Witch Project. A lot of remakes of the time, like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Hills Have Eyes, and Friday the 13th, were seen as bad on their release because of how tired audiences were with the movie remake trend of the 2000s. However, they've seen a bit of a recent resurgence of popularity. Movies like The Hills Have Eyes remake are seen as a great movie for a younger generation with how far we are from the release of the original.
Out of all of them, Zack Snyder's 2004 zombie remake of the beloved George Romero classic Dawn of the Dead sits at the top as one of the best horror movie remakes and helped merge zombies with the rage-infected humans of 28 Days Later. Fast-moving zombies ready to eat your flesh even with something as small as a bite, set in the same set piece as its original, a suburban mall with the undead surrounding it. The movie's success helped kickstart the career of both Zack Snyder and James Gunn, although James Gunn had already received previous popularity from the Scooby-Doo movies.
I'm Mary Jane.
Like, that is my favorite name.
Really?
Yeah.
Although horror fans were upset and thought that he didn't have the credentials needed to write it, Dawn of the Dead was loved by both audiences and critics as it updated the zombie subgenre for the modern age. During the same year, Edgar Wright would throw his own hat in the ring with his second directed film. Shaun of the Dead became an instant hit and started Wright's Three Flavors Cornetto trilogy with Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, and The World's End. The movie's blend of humor eased audience members into the subgenre and became an instant, highly revered classic. However, on set, a lot of the film's cast and crew weren't as confident with the movie, thinking it might not even see the light of day.
When we were shooting the scene with the zombies outside the pub, one of the zombies in makeup came up to me, thinking that I was a runner, and just looked over at me and went, "Whew, straight to video for this one."
Luckily, Wright created not only one of the greatest zombie films ever made, but it's filled to the brim with references to both pop culture and older horror films. The radio played during Sean's walk to the store references a space probe that's the same as in Night of the Living Dead.
The American Deep Space Probe Omega-6, due to return to Earth this weekend, and expected to re-enter Earth's atmosphere.
The fish shop is called Fulci's Restaurant, a reference to the Italian director Lucio Fulci, who created multiple zombie films like Zombie 2 and City of the Living Dead. Foray is the last name of the actor Ken Foray, who played Peter in Dawn of the Dead. Landis is a reference to director John Landis, who created An American Werewolf in London. And David's death is a direct reference to Rhodes' death in Day of the Dead.
I don't want to cause a fuss. We're coming to get you, Barbara!
Edgar Wright tried contacting all of the bands and artists to get their input on the hilarious scene of when Sean and Ed start throwing vinyl records at the two zombies in their backyard. Sade was one of the only artists to give a response, and they were ecstatic about the scene, saying that they could destroy the album without hesitation.
That's Lizzie's. Yeah, but she did dump you. Oh! Up there, some gun in the shed.
When Edgar Wright would go on to direct Scott Pilgrim vs. the World 6 years later, he would create a cover of Sade's song By Your Side as a nod to her good sportsmanship for letting them destroy one of their albums in Shaun of the Dead.
Come on.
The zombie subgenre became vast, with directors throwing their hats into the ring, exploding through the 2000s with Wreck, 28 Days Later, Shaun of the Dead, Dawn of the Dead, Resident Evil, Planet Terror, and Zombieland, leading to 2010, where the genre hit mainstream audiences on the small screen.
Oh, not dead! Come on, come on!
Much like the 1970s and 1980s, the 2010s contain an outlandish amount of amazing horror films and media, so much that I could talk about it for another hour or two. The 2010s were a huge revival of the genre with impactful films like Jordan Peele's Get Out, along with Ari Aster's Hereditary and Midsommar. The genre hit the mainstream at the start of 2010 when AMC released The Walking Dead, continuing to capitalize on the zombie subgenre that became popular thanks to the zombie craze that quickly gained steam throughout the 2000s. The horror genre would also evolve throughout the decade as streaming services created horror movies and TV shows that helped hook the public audience into the genre, much like Mike Flanagan's Haunting of Hill House. Episodic horror became a large trend in the 2010s for both television and streaming services, pulling the inspiration of their format from the anthology shows of the past like Tales from the Crypt or The Twilight Zone by releasing new episodes every week. Online, streaming services let horror fans binge hours of content instead of waiting on a weekly basis, and exploded when shows like Stranger Things became cultural icons. Mike Flanagan would become another big name in horror after releasing Oculus and Hush before creating The Haunting of Hill House in 2018, adding more seasonal anthologies into the genre. Independent horror would also become more readily available, with services like Shudder being able to bring marginalized creators to those who already enjoyed the genre. Movies that would have otherwise been left into obscurity from a limited theatrical release gained popularity through their streaming services run, like The Autopsy of Jane Doe when it was released on Netflix. Independent films are a staple in the horror genre, which is what keeps it interesting and revolutionary since they're not majorly controlled by big commercial studios. No recent film embodies that feeling more than David Mitchell's It Follows.
Some of this, right down to the wardrobe, is I mean, she's in high heels, which I've had some people sort of point out, questioning, does that make a lot of sense? And the answer is no. It's definitely a bit of a play on the conventions of horror, all the way back to referencing women in peril from even like De Palma movies, for instance.
I watched this the year it came out on Blu-ray because there weren't any theaters near me that were showing it, and the movie blew me away in 2014 or 15, really causing a revitalization in my love for horror films. During the 2000s, a lot of horror movies were utilizing new technology with digital video and DV with cameras like the Canon XL1 as movies began to move away from celluloid. Handheld and quick, dirty, gritty shots filled with realism became the norm for the genre, so when It Follows came out, I was so taken aback by it. It wasn't reliant on this handheld camera work and instead went back to movies like Halloween with these locked off shots, dollies, and pans. With the soundtrack provided by Disaster Piece, the score for the film brought the tension up another notch. One of the coolest things about It Follows is this forced sense of surrealism by mixing props from different points of time and putting them together so the movie doesn't age with repeat viewings. The use of CRTs, however, the sister still has a form of an e-reader, the mixture of both modern and older vehicles, corded phones. You'd think that this movie might take place in the 90s with how retro some of the technology is with these stacks of radios and CRTs, but the opening scene literally has a 2012 Nissan Versa. These abandoned, empty suburban homes of the Detroit suburbs have cars from the 2000s sitting in their driveways. It all culminates to this very interesting, surreal fantasy world that doesn't exist but is grounded in reality with a supernatural twist. Along with The Babadook, It Follows marks an interesting turn in horror. Movies were a lot more methodical and stylized with these auteur-like scenes reminiscent of the French New Wave movement from the 1960s, as well as the influence of movies from the 80s classics. The 2010s sought out a revival for horror films with more sophisticated stories, characters, and cinematography in its independent films, and as the indie scene became more prominent as streaming services began to take over, commercialized horror films began to blossom with the beginning of Blumhouse Productions. Blumhouse was initially started with a low-budget model of business where they would create these films with seemingly no money and release them for a theatrical run, striking gold with Paranormal Activity in 2007. By the year 2010, Blumhouse would bring in the original creators of the 2004 film Saw with James Wan and Leigh Whannell to release Insidious.
It's not the house that's haunted. It's your son.
On a budget of $1.5 million, Insidious would go on to make back over $100 million and spark the trend of supernatural horror films from the 2010s. James Wan is somewhat of an idol for me. First off, he's an Asian American director, which is something that I can relate to, and is this huge genre fan. It's like he's just this kid in a toy shop getting to play with these movies, IPs, and insane ideas.
I guess like a lot of the directors out there, the scary movie genre is definitely the best genre to break out with. You can really prove yourself. All the directors that I admire starts out with a horror film. And I definitely have a true love for it, and it's definitely like the one genre that really allows you to do things outside of the box that most of the film genre wouldn't let you or can't get away with.
His style is very 80s Italian horror, like Argento's Inferno, utilizing constant zooms and gothic set pieces. And that style really comes through during the last few minutes of Insidious when we reach the lipstick-faced demon's lair. It just oozes Argento, and you can see this influence of opera on the set. James Wan went on to create The Conjuring, birthing an entire cinematic universe for horror fans with New Line Cinema and cementing his mark on modern-day horror films. Blumhouse Productions continues to make low-budget films such as Upgrade, Whiplash, BlacKkKlansman, and 2018's Halloween requel. However, its most influential horror film is Jordan Peele's Get Out from 2017.
It began as the fun of a horror story. It's my favorite genre. I wanted to have fun while writing. The power of story, when you have a protagonist, the whole trick that all of us are trying to do is bring the audience into that protagonist's eyes. A good story is one of the few ways we can really not tell somebody you have to feel for somebody else, but make somebody feel because they're experiencing it through entertainment.
Sink into the floor.
Wait.
Sink.
Get Out is the 6th horror film to ever be nominated for Best Picture out of the over 90-year span that the Academy Awards have been around, with Jordan Peele making waves being nominated for Best Director in a low-budget debut feature film, premiering during a time when tension in the United States were at an all-time high. You could say that the success of Get Out is almost mirrored to the success of George Romero's Night of the Living Dead. The Sunken Place is such a strong visual representation of oppression where you can see exactly what's happening, and no matter how much you scream and shout, nothing is going to help you.
The main reason as to why I love Get Out so much is because it opens up this conversation about black representation in horror films. In general, it's been pretty bad up until around, like the 90s when People Under the Stairs, Tales from the Hood, and Candyman came out, but even Candyman kind of goes back to the whole black man lusting for white women trope.
Get Out finds its mark by creating this smart, black male lead that people of color can relate to who's trying to survive in this space occupied by these extremely rich and powerful white people who want to kill you because of the color of your skin. And while Get Out and Jordan Peele were nominated for multiple awards in 2018, the Academy would go on to snub his next film, Us, with 0 nominations, even for celebrating the amazing performance of Lupita Nyong'o. Horror films are extremely low on the totem pole for Academy Awards, and with performances like Toni Collette in Hereditary, it's becoming difficult to ignore the Academy's hesitation with the genre.
Just said, I'm sorry, or faced up to what happened. Maybe, Dan, we could do something with this, but you can't take responsibility for anything. So now I can't accept, and I can't forgive.
Ari Aster's debut film Hereditary broke new ground for the independent entertainment company A24 by becoming its highest grossing picture before 2022 when they released Everything Everywhere All at Once. Being the 4th film that the company produced, Hereditary became critically acclaimed and quickly solidified itself as one of the greatest horror films of all time.
I watched this in theaters when it came out, and the movie, it fucked me up. It's probably the scariest movie that I watched in the 2010s, and I think a majority of that comes from its very brutal, striking, and surreal images like seeing Charlie's head after the accident.
Watching Allison decapitate herself and her body floating to the treehouse, Payman's body, the husband caught on fire, seeing all of that tied into these themes of trauma and abuse, toxic relationships, mental illness, and motherhood, with these vivid scenes makes the movie feel as though it's a cut above the rest. Hereditary is a masterpiece, and A24's influence on the horror genre, along with Blumhouse, has created this huge revival of horror where we're getting these amazing movies left and right that aren't just schlock and awe, but also sophisticated. 80s slashers and exploitation storylines no longer enticed audiences who wanted films that were new, slick, and dealt with heavier themes. However, there's a lot of endearment and flavor when it comes to low-budget independent films that really stick with you, and the independent scene of horror is more vast than it's ever been, with more ways to view them that has ever been possible. Commercial studios have been pushing horror films into theaters because of how well they're consistently doing. Compared to the superhero films of today, horror movies have been hitting box office records more often than any other genre in the industry. This can be seen as either a good or bad thing, as commercial horror films are made to make these giant studios large chunks of money. However, independent horror films are love letters from directors who adore the genre and want to tell their tales without having studios influence the contents of the movies that they're creating. Terrifier, created by Damien Leone, is probably the most well-known version of what independent horror is like in the modern day. Not only is Art the Clown just a gem to see on camera, the special effects are also incredibly well done. As far as subtext, there is none. As far as themes, it's hard to find. As far as the story goes, it's very minimal. By all means, Terrifier is very straightforward, and that's really what makes it so good. There is no deeper meaning, there is no context or subtext of trauma like a lot of recent horror films that try to shove it into their storylines. It's a very cut and dry slasher film with updated graphics and a great antagonist that's as fun to watch do their work as much as iconic slashers of the 80s. Although originally just a side character in All Hallows Eve from a short called Terrifier, Damien Leone would crowdsource the creation of the feature-length film Terrifier and then crowdsource his next film Terrifier 2 that released in theaters in 2023 by being distributed by Bloody Disgusting, who also helped produce VHS, a found footage anthology horror film which now has 5 other films under its franchise and umbrella.
God. I once made a movie, rather tongue-in-cheek, called Psycho.
Yes.
And of course, a lot of people looked at this thing and said, what a dreadful thing to do, how awful, and so forth. But of course, it was, to me, it had great elements of the cinema in it. The content as such was, I felt, rather amusing. And it was a big joke, you know. And I was horrified to find that some people took it seriously. It was intended to cause people to scream and yell and so forth, but no more than the screaming and yelling on the Switchback Railway.
We currently live in a world where horror films are slowly becoming more recognized for the amount of sheer talent that's been consistently represented throughout the history of the genre. Films that would have once passed through studios' eyes are now readily available and created by these loving directors that enjoy the genre as much as any horror fan would. With films and TV shows popping up from all around the world, even foreign films are beginning to become accepted by Western media. All of these movies and their culmination of history makes watching a horror film become increasingly more interesting when you can spot the homages and references that the movies are calling out, along with topics that you don't see discussed very often in other movies outside of the genre. Writing off horror films because of an elitist reason that was formed off of critics' consistent bashing of the genre cuts you off from a large amount of film history and movies that are so culturally influential it's hard to ignore. With all the films that culminate to the collective of the horror genre and the impact they've had on film history, it really makes you wonder what new horror films are going to be influencing the future of the genre.